Jim Dan went to take a shower, while remembered what the doctor had said. He had thought it was just having nightmares, but he hadn't expected those symptoms to really appear, and he even had to undergo treatment. But even if he received treatment, the current situation wouldn't change right away. Also, why was Player Ju taking care of him? His goal must be this, right? So he started making preparations in advance. At that moment, Player Ju was outside talking on the phone, and Jim Dan had already finished showering and come out. Hearing the sound behind him, Player Ju turned his head and saw Jim Dan drinking again. Remembering the doctor's instructions, Player Ju hurried over and snatched the bottle away. "Are you crazy? The doctor clearly said you can't drink." Swaying, Jim Dan said, "If I don't drink, I can't sleep." He even asked back, "This alcohol is expensive, right? Add the cost of the booze onto the debt I owe you. And today's medical fees, transportation, the restaurant and lodging costs. Calculate them all clearly and add them in. Anyway, you helping me isn't out of kindness, is it?" Player Ju was baffled, thinking who would do all this just for money. Before he could finish, Jim Dan cut him off directly. "You've gone this far for me because you want to fix me quickly and then keep using me, right?" Hearing that, Player Ju was instantly enraged. "Isn't all of this because of you? If you don't take care of yourself, you only make the people around you worry." Jim Dan stared at him and asked, "So you brought me here because you're worried about me too?" Question like that, Player Ju fell silent. Jim Dan's gaze suddenly dimmed, and he turned his head to the side. As expected, "It's not. I'm not as bad as you think, and I just can't sleep. It hasn't affected my work. If it's playing games, then there won't be any problems at all." When Player Zhou heard that, he was completely stunned. "Are you crazy? Why did you suddenly bring this up?" Jim Dan didn't explain and went straight to start a match against him. Player Zhou was so angry with him that his whole body was trembling. His brain was about to explode. Just now he had even thought that Jim Dan had fallen into the sea. Player Zhou was scared out of his wits on the spot. After finishing breakfast, Player Zhou took Jim Dan back to the countryside. Then, as Player Zhou was taking Jim Dan back to the countryside, he suddenly received a call from the coach on the way. The coach asked Player Zhou, "You're not in Seoul right now, are you? This time the match will be held in Thailand. The representatives over there said that on the return trip they will transfer in Korea and would like to see you once. So come to Seoul tomorrow." As soon as Player Zhou heard this, he got mad. "How can you only tell me something this important now? I was just in Seoul." The coach explained that they had only just received the contact as well. Now they want to start arranging matches for you once your suspension period is over in the autumn. It wasn't just Player Zhou. Jim Dan, who was next to him, was also shaken when he heard this news. The coach asked Player Zhou, "You'll come, right?" He agreed, and the coach reminded him again, "Remember to dress more formally tomorrow." After they got back to the place they were staying that evening, Player Zhou started practicing boxing in the yard. As soon as he thought about matches being scheduled soon, can he really perform well in a match with how he is now? His form still hasn't fully returned. Jim Dan had that same expression again. "Should I hurry up and look for other staff? But then I won't be able to show my full ability. What should I do? Do I have to go straight back to Seoul and start training right away? That bastard Baek Junmyung. It's all because of that guy." The more Player John thought about it, the angrier he got. His fists flew faster and faster, and the next second, a sudden headache hit him again. After washing up, Player John lay on the bed, with a pile of worries weighing on his mind. In his current condition, there was no way he could compete. The problem had to be solved as soon as possible. Right after that, he remembered Jim Dan's dejected look. Nothing was going smoothly at all. The more he thought about it, the more irritated he became, and the pain in his head started throbbing again. Things had clearly been normal for a while, so why was it happening again? Just then, he heard the landlord grandpa knocking on the door. "Junyoung, I'm sorry to bother you so late. Could you come over to my place for a moment?" After following the landlord over, Player John saw Jim Dan, drunk and passed out. Again, the landlord told him that the villagers had found Jim Dan outside. As soon as he heard, he brought him back, but he really couldn't lift him alone, so he came to ask for help. If Jim Dan could walk home by himself, it would be great. But he was sleeping too deeply, and no amount of calling would wake him up. Looking at the state Jim Dan was in, Player John finally couldn't hold it in anymore and clenched his teeth. He stepped forward and yanked Jim Dan down in one harsh pull. Then he tossed him onto the floor. The next second, a basin of cold water was dumped straight over him. Jim Dan woke up immediately. He lifted his head and met Player John's gaze in front of him. Player Zhou's face was dark, and he couldn't suppress his anger. He flung the basin hard, then turned around and left in a huff. The landlord hurried forward to help Jim Dan up and asked if he was okay. The next day, Player Zhou arrived in Seoul to meet with the representative. After they chatted for a while, the representative told him that there was no way for him to enter the main event right away, but that he could first help Player Zhou get matched with players of similar ranking. During the period when Player Zhou was resting, his ranking had indeed fluctuated. If Player Zhou didn't mind, he could be matched immediately. The coach also spoke very bluntly to Player Zhou. He hadn't competed for too long, so his ranking had dropped a bit. Plus, he lost in the previous main event, so now he was ranked third. Player Zhou only replied with one sentence, "I know." Then the coach turned and asked the representative, "How is that investigation going?" The representative said, "We've already confirmed the identity of the culprit who handed the whey protein to Player Zhou at the time. The culprit is a Korean settled in the United States and is presumed to be a member of a Korean crime organization, likely acting on someone's orders. He has disappeared for now and is still wanted. In addition, the spray incident may also have been instigated by the same person behind the scenes. As for whether that person is from player Baek Junmyong's side, it still needs further investigation." The representative also solemnly apologized to the coach and Player Zhou for the staff's rudeness toward Jim Dan last time. After the serious matters were finished, Player Zhou continued driving, heading toward the countryside. The scene from yesterday flashed through his mind again, and he realized that he had become too sensitive because of the competition. That outburst just now was him truly losing his temper. Yesterday he had just gone to the hospital, yet that guy still drank so much. Is he insane? He can't even take care of his own body. It's absolutely terrible. He can't endure this any longer. He has to start preparing for the competition immediately. In the car, the radio suddenly started broadcasting the weather report. A reminder to everyone. Strong wind alert. Please pay attention to safety. On the road, Player Zhou saw a large crowd gathered by the seaside. Out on the sea, there were even Coast Guard officers. Player Zhou didn't think much of it. He drove straight back to his place. When the car pulled up at the door, Player Zhou suddenly froze. The next second, he turned around and walked toward the place next door where Jim Dan lived. At this moment, he saw footprints on the ground. He followed the direction of the footprints with his eyes. Player Zhou recalled again that night when Jim Dan was sleepwalking, and the scene of him walking step by step into the sea. Adding that to what he had just seen on the road, Player Zhou's heart suddenly sank. He immediately rushed out. He drove straight toward the seaside where the crowd had gathered. He grabbed someone and asked, "What happened here?" The woman was startled by him and said that a young man had gotten drunk and fallen into the sea. She added that the waves were very strong today, and the person had been swept far away. At that point, there was probably no hope anymore. Player Zhou's face went rigid, his eyes full of disbelief. He saw a rescue boat parked over there. He strode straight toward it. The next second, he jumped onto the boat. The Coast Guard immediately stopped him. "Hey, who are you? You can't just get on the boat." Player Zhou struggled with all his might to get past, until he clearly saw what that person looked like. Player Zhou finally let out a small sigh of relief. "It wasn't a Jim Dan." At that moment, Jim Dan's voice came from behind. What are you doing here?" Seeing Jim Dan standing perfectly fine right in front of him, Zhou the athlete's whole body instantly went limp. Panting, he climbed ashore and walked up to Jim Dan, suddenly pulling him into a tight hug. Because of what he had just done, Zhou the athlete started to wonder, why was he so nervous about Jim Dan? The director had noticed that Jim Dan had been very exhausted lately. He seemed sick every day, and since starting work here, he had never taken any personal leave. So today the director specifically let him take a day off first. Grandpa saw Jim Dan at home and found it a bit strange. Why didn't he go to work today? After learning that Jim Dan was off today, Grandpa asked if he could help out and go to the market together to buy some things. On the way back, Zhou the athlete suddenly rushed over and held Jim Dan in a crushing embrace. Jim Dan was stunned on the spot. Zhou the athlete was gasping for breath. He was hugging too hard, gripping him so tightly he wouldn't let go, that everything in Jim Dan's hands fell all over the ground. Jim Dan immediately told Zhou the athlete to let go. Only then did Zhou the athlete seem to snap out of it, and he suddenly released Jim Dan. "I thought it was you." Jim Dan felt even more confused. What was he talking about? Zhou the athlete explained haltingly. "You fell into the water, and then you told him again, it's fine." At that moment, Grandpa walked over, his face full of puzzlement. "What's going on?" Jim Dan noticed that someone had recognized Player Zhou, so he quietly reminded him, "I don't know why you're doing this, but if you keep this up here, something bad is going to happen." Player Zhou also understood that this really wasn't appropriate. Grandpa asked Player Zhou, "Are you okay? You look really pale." Jim Dan picked up the things, told Player Zhou that he would go back first, and then called to Grandpa, "Let's go." Player Zhou just stood there, frozen in place. He stared at Jim Dan's receding back, his mind still stuck on that moment just now, unable to react. After he got back to the front door of his house, player Zhou was still repeatedly thinking about what had happened, completely unable to figure out what on earth he was doing. In that instant, he thought the person who had fallen into the water might be Jim Dan, and his reason simply snapped. Then, when Jim Dan appeared in front of him again, he finally felt like he could breathe and let out a sigh of relief, so he lost control and went up to hug him. It seemed he was really going crazy. Shouldn't he be glad that the one who fell wasn't Jim Dan? After a while, player Zhou suddenly sobered up. Could it be that? No, couldn't possibly be like that. When he woke up the next day, player Zhou kept sneezing, and he hadn't expected that he would actually catch a cold. Over at the Light of Beauty Sanatorium, Jim Dan was pushing a patient, getting ready to go back to the ward. But in his head, he was still stuck on the scene from last night. Just then, the patient called out to him, "Therapist." Jim Dan snapped back to his senses, thinking something had happened. But when he looked, he realized he had walked too far, and immediately apologized in a low voice. He hurriedly brought the person back to the ward, where the TV in the room was broadcasting sports news. The athlete Zhu Zhejiang, who once won a championship, is planning to suspend competition this fall and return to the ring after his suspension ends. It was also officially announced today that Zhu Zhejiang's schedule for October this year is being arranged. According to Zhu Zhejiang's camp, his shoulder injury has almost healed, and they judge that it's safe for him to compete. As soon as the news of his comeback came out, it immediately drew massive attention. At this moment, an old grandpa watching the news suddenly shouted, "Don't be ridiculous. Recover. A shoulder injury needs at least half a year of rest. Don't you even know that basic common sense? For someone who's an athlete, he can't even take care of his own body. Just watch. He's bound to get an even worse injury before he wakes up. People like that don't deserve to be athletes at all." Just then, the patient Jim Dan was pushing started muttering, "That old man is at it again. He keeps cursing at the TV while watching the news. Every day, as soon as he sees sports news, he flies into a rage, and the noise is driving everyone crazy." The grandpa in front heard this, suddenly spun around, and yelled at them, "Are you talking about me? I heard everything." Later, when Jim Dan was treating him, the grandpa also told him that he used to be an athlete, and there wasn't a single part of his body that hadn't been injured. He asked Jim Dan if he'd heard of that gold medal athlete. "Back then, that guy was no match for me at all. I kept pushing myself to get better, unlike today's athletes, who start acting all arrogant as soon as they get a bit of success. Don't you think so too?" Jim Dan said that he had been watching the news very intently just now, and it looked like he really knew a lot about combat sports. Grandpa told Jim Dan that he himself wasn't very sure how the current fighting competitions actually worked. If it weren't for all the trouble that guy Zhu Zhejiang kept causing, he wouldn't know anything about it either. That kid still got a long way to go. He won a single championship and already started walking around with his chin up, and in the end he got disqualified and lost. If it were me, I would have quit long ago out of sheer embarrassment. Then Grandpa asked Jim Dan if it was because of him that he had come to this hospital. Jim Dan froze for a moment, wondering how he could possibly know. Grandpa said the news had already spread everywhere. "You're the grandson of that old lady in the next room, right? You look naive, way too simple-minded. One look and I can tell that if he fools around with you a bit, you'll soften up and then suffer for it. You need to keep your guard up." Jim Dan felt a little awkward and could only murmur a reply under his breath. "Fix him up." On the way back to the ward, Jim Dan saw Fighter Zhou at the front desk registering to see a doctor. Fighter Zhou coughed and glanced sideways at him. Then he immediately turned around and left. Jim Dan hurried after him to explain that his schedule nearby was fully booked today, so he couldn't treat him. Without even looking back, Fighter Zhou said, "I didn't come here for you. It's just that this is the closest hospital." Watching him cough like that, Jim Dan grew even more puzzled. What exactly was wrong with him? At this point, Grandpa finally couldn't hold back anymore. "Look at that guy. He's exactly the same as on TV. Still that way. No future at all." The moment he heard that, Fighter Zhou's steps suddenly came to a halt. Then he turned around with a look of complete surprise. "You wouldn't happen to be the director, would you?" Grandpa's face darkened with anger. "You only recognize me now? You ungrateful brat." So, player Zhou had been this unwilling to admit defeat since he was a child. The director had always kept him in his heart. Player Zhou looked utterly incredulous. This person in front of him was actually his former director. Jim Dan also felt that something was off. The director trembled with rage. "After you went to Seoul, you never contacted me even once?" Player Zhou was even more confused. Why would he be here? The director was so angry with him on the spot. "Why else? Of course, because I'm not feeling well. But you, how did you let yourself end up like this? Can't even take care of your own body. Player Zhou was just about to speak and ask about his health. The next second, the director directly yelled at him. I'm old. It's normal to feel unwell. Get away from me. Don't pass your illness to me. And you stinky brat. If you want to win the championship, then take care of your body. After saying that, he had Jim Dan help him back. Player Zhou was left standing there in a daze. That night, after they got home, Jim Ju was washing the dishes and Jim Dan was also washing the dishes, but he kept replaying what had happened during the day. Jim Ju had never expected that grandpa would turn out to be Player Zhou's former director, and he was also the person who had trained together before Player Zhou joined. No, actually that's normal. Of course Player Zhou had a time when he was a rookie. Seeing that they hadn't met for so long, their relationship probably wasn't very good. It was probably not a very good relationship. Hey, is it because they're master and disciple? Even their tempers are so alike. His thoughts suddenly became very tangled. That day, because he heard the news that Player Zhou was going to compete again, it suddenly made people think of the past. In a moment of turmoil, he drank, and I can also understand why Player Zhou would be angry. But at that time, why did he have to do that? Could it be that he thought I had had an accident? Back then he held me so tightly. So tight I could barely breathe. I was really frightened. Why did he have to go that far? But even if I really had an accident, to Player Zhou, would it be something very serious? On the third day, Player Zhou still went to the sanatorium and found the director. As soon as the two met, their tempers flared and they started snapping at each other. The nurses outside were stunned seeing them like that. Could they be quarreling? Seeing the director again, Player Zhou suddenly became like a child, saying his shoulder was completely healed. But it had only been a few years since they last met. How had all of the director's muscles disappeared? The moment the director heard that, he exploded. What? I'm still tough. I could send a guy like you flying with one punch. Player Zhou also shot to his feet. How could it be done with just one punch? Why don't you try it? The two of them went back and forth. Neither was willing to back down. In the end, it was the director who felt unwell, unable even to stand steadily. Player Zhou hurried over and helped him sit down. Even on the way taking him out for a walk, the three of them kept talking. The two of them still wouldn't stop talking, and Jim Dan behind them watched in confusion. Is this kind of relationship considered good? After that, Player Zhou took the director out to see the sea. The director kept talking about something the entire way, but Player Zhou just stood to the side, quietly listening. After sending the director back, Player Zhou happened to run into Jim Dan. He only said to Jim Dan, "You go sleep by yourself first." Seeing that Player Zhou kept coughing, Jim Dan was a bit worried too. Although he had already taken medicine, Player Zhou still felt really unwell, and he even had a fever. He hadn't expected to run into the director here. It instantly made people think of the past. At night, when Jim Dan was doing his rounds, he saw that in the ward, Grandma was sleeping very soundly. Only then did Jim Dan finally show a relieved smile. Then he went on to check the other patients' wards, but he heard a huge commotion inside. When he went in and asked, he found out it was because the director was watching a live sports broadcast in the middle of the night, and everyone thought he was too noisy. The director shot back directly. A new Korean player is about to debut. Of course I have to watch the live broadcast. How can I analyze it without listening to the sound? If you don't get it, just stay quiet. Jim Dan asked him, if you still don't want to sleep, how about watching it outside the ward? I'll take you there. Then Jim Dan took him to the break room. Then I'll wait right next to you. Call me when you feel like sleeping. The next second, the director grabbed him. Where are you going? I'm really bored. Stay here and keep me company. So Jim Dan obediently sat down beside him. Watching him stare at the live broadcast while writing something, Jim Dan couldn't help feeling curious about what exactly he was writing. The director said, I'm analyzing the match. At least if I do this, I won't be even more bored. In the past, I would always record videos of my students' matches. Then after the match ended, I'd watch and take notes at the same time. I've kept this habit up to now, and it just so happens I can't sleep either. He was turning the page when a photo suddenly slipped out and fell. Jim Dan reacted quickly and immediately helped him pick it up. After clearly seeing the person in the photo, he looked up and asked the curator, the person next to you, is that Player Ju? The curator lowered his head and glanced at the person he was pointing to. Then he told him, that's Ju Jaegyong. Jim Dan stared at Player Ju in the photo. Jim Dan was a little curious. What kind of child had he actually been? The curator took off his glasses. That kid really opened my eyes. I've taught countless students, but that was the first time I'd seen someone be that hard on himself. So Player Ju had been this unfortunate even as a child. All his current achievements were earned by gritting his teeth and working relentlessly. The curator thought back to 20 years ago, to the day he first met Ju Jaegyong. Got you, brat. "So you're the one who's been stealing my family's milk, huh?" While he was struggling with him, the curator realized the boy's body was covered in injuries. It was the first time the curator had seen a child that badly hurt. Sigh. He looked like that all over, but his eyes were so bright it was scary. After shaking off the curator's hand, little Ju turned and bolted. He ran home as fast as he could. Because there was no food at home, little Ju could only use this method to barely fill his stomach. Who knew that while he was drinking the milk, the door would suddenly be pushed open? That familiar sense of oppression descended on him once again. In that slum-like neighborhood, little Ju's father was a notorious thug. A whole bunch of bad habits. Whenever he was in a bad mood, he would start hitting people on the street. As his child, of course Xiao Zhou couldn't escape either. His mom had already run away from home long ago. In other words, there was basically no one to take care of him. That day, Xiao Zhou went again to the director's front door. He saw milk hanging on the milk box, and on the door plate it even said, "Fresh milk delivered every morning and evening." He timed it just right and reached out again, wanting to grab it. At that moment the door suddenly opened. "You're here again, little thief. Come in." Xiao Zhou was startled on the spot and immediately backed away. Seeing him so uncooperative, the director grew angry. "Before I hand you over to the police officers, get over here right now." He then handed over the bread and milk. "Here you go. From now on you're not allowed to steal other people's food. I'll put it here and you take it to eat." Xiao Zhou simply couldn't believe it, but he was really too hungry, and once the door closed, he still couldn't help eating. After that, the director really did hang bread and milk at the door every day. Over time, only then did Xiao Zhou slowly begin to trust him. The director asked him how old he was, but Xiao Zhou only focused on eating, not even lifting his head. The director held back his anger and reminded him, "When an adult asks you something, you must answer immediately." Xiao Zhou lowered his head and counted on his fingers. He held up his hand to show a 6. Only 6 years old and already this thin. He was clearly malnourished. His development had even been delayed. The director then asked him what his name was. He heard him say his name was Zhu Zhejiang. The director reacted at once. He was the son of Zhu Jiang from upstairs. The director reached out and grabbed his arm, his voice sinking. "These were all done by your dad?" Xiao Zhou suddenly shoved him away. "Don't touch me, it really hurts." The director immediately pulled his hand back and hastily said he understood, promising he wouldn't touch him again. Zhu Jiang was probably a boxing athlete in the past too, but later went down the wrong path. Then this kid, could he also have talent? The director asked him if he wanted to learn boxing. If he learned it well, he could make a living from it in the future. Once you become a fighter, you can earn money, and if you win a championship, you might turn your life around overnight. When he heard, "turn your life around," Xiao Zhou's eyes immediately lit up. The director added, "If you come, I'll also give you meals." At that time, the director gathered the kids in the community who were not doing well into the boxing gym he ran. He cooked for them, took care of them, and also taught suitable kids how to box. There were too many children in the community lacking parental care, so Director Mom decided to step up and help. That day, Xiao Zhou walked upstairs. As soon as Director Mom saw him, she smiled, very happily. "Are you the new kid?" Facing this stranger in front of him, Xiao Zhou was still a little scared. Later, Director Mom brought him inside and served him a bowl of freshly cooked noodle soup. There were other children eating with him as well. Xiao Zhou stared at that bowl of noodle soup, and his mouth almost started watering. He immediately began to wolf it down. Director Mom understood at a glance. He really was starving. She reached out to gently rub his head, telling him to eat slowly, saying, "There's plenty here. Don't be afraid." This sudden shower of concern made Xiao Zhou instantly feel shy. But the kids next to him, seeing him like that, had nothing but disdain on their faces. After that, they went to the boxing arena again. Xiao Zhou suddenly heard someone calling him. Right after that, the other party threw a helmet over and told him to put it on. Xiao Zhou didn't understand what they wanted to do, but under the coercion of several people, he still put the helmet on. The very next second, what came was a flurry of punches and kicks. The head coach heard the commotion and rushed over immediately, but this group of guys still wouldn't stop. "You dare bully my friend? All of you, get over here." Even though they tried to twist right and wrong, the coach was an adult and could tell at a glance what was going on. He gave them a harsh beating on the spot. At first, Xiao Zhou simply came here to eat. Later, he trained in boxing more and more seriously, as if he had taken this on as his own cause. Of course, he suffered a lot in the process. In the blink of an eye, several more years passed, and the training facilities were finally renovated. Xiao Zhou also gradually grew up. Every time training ended, Xiao Zhou would walk into the phone booth and call his mom, but the call on the other end never went through. That day, He stared at the boxing tournament registration poster on the wall. Boxing tournament registration poster. Xiao Zhou said to the coach directly, "I want to sign up for this." On the day of the match, Xiao Zhou still wasn't a match for his opponent. He lost on the spot. The coach sat in the audience watching until his head hurt. Everyone said Zhu Zhejiang was a genius, but the coach knew best. He definitely wasn't. His strength was all built up punch by punch, purely through hard work. That day, Xiao Zhou came to the phone booth again, but still no one answered. So Xiao Zhou left a voice message. "Mom, when are you coming back? Are you still afraid of Dad? I'll earn a lot of money and I'll beat Dad too. When I manage to do that one day, come back home then. Okay? I really will work very hard." Zhu Zhejiang finally won the championship through his own effort, but he never again had the chance to share it with his father. In order to earn tuition, player Zhu has done every kind of job. He finally relied on his own efforts to get into middle school. That day, Mr. Park called Zhejiang to the academic affairs office and asked if he was boxing now. Zhejiang said yes. Mr. Park then asked, "Have you considered other sports? From the way you move, I think you're more suited to other events. Football and baseball are both doing very well these days." At this moment, the PE teacher walked over. "Mr. Park, give it up. I've already had him try. I also felt it was a pity for him to only box, so I let him try other sports. His athletic reflexes really are excellent, but he has no sense of team play at all and is always getting into fights with his teammates." As he spoke, he raised his hand and knocked on Zhejiang's head. "Kid, rein in that rotten temper of yours." Listening to this gave Mr. Park a headache too, and he asked Zhejiang, "Why are you so fixated only on boxing?" Zhejiang said it was because he wanted to make money. Mr. Park pressed him, "Then lately, have you actually made any money from boxing? I remember your match results aren't that good either." Mr. Park paused. "How about you just study seriously and get into a university? You're only in first year. You still have plenty of time." Mr. Park went on, "There are also many special admission channels. Even if you don't study like crazy, your grades are already good enough." Zhejiang was silent for a while. He still said he wanted to do boxing. "I'm done talking. I'm leaving." As soon as he finished, he stood up and went straight out. Teacher Park was speechless on the spot. What an insolent brat. That day at the gym, Zhejiang felt something was wrong. "Today, it's just me?" the director told him. Everyone else wasn't coming. Zhejiang was even more puzzled. The director sighed. "They said it's hard to make it with this sport, and it takes too long." He gave a cold laugh. "Right now, they're probably working as lackeys for some punk, running around collecting money. Really disappointing. I didn't want them to turn out like that. That's why I've been feeding them since they were kids and teaching them how to be decent people." The more the director spoke, the more worked up he got. A bunch of ungrateful brats. If my mom saw this from heaven, she'd probably want to come down and beat them up. He turned his head to look at Zhejiang. "Since you're here, start with jump rope first." So Zhejiang just kept training like that, practicing until it was almost dark. On the way back, Zhejiang suddenly heard someone calling him. The blonde asked him, "You just came out of the gym?" Zhejiang stared at the blonde in front of him. "Who are you?" The blonde got angry as soon as he heard that. "This guy actually asked who I am? We clearly trained together. I'm Bak Juno." As the blonde spoke, he pulled out a cigarette and held it out to Zhejiang. "Want one?" Zhejiang said smoking would worsen his lung capacity and refused outright. The blonde cursed him as really stubborn in his heart, then kept rummaging in his pocket. "Even if you smoke just once, would your ability really drop? Then try this." Zhejiang frowned. "What's this?" Huang Mao lowered his voice and said this was something better, something that could make his punches in boxing hit harder. After listening, Zijing rejected it immediately. At that moment, another person leaned in and, smiling, asked, "You're not selling it to others? Someone like you who can fight and is quick on his feet. If you help us sell, everyone will feel reassured." Huang Mao followed up right away. "This is something a big brother I know is pushing. Selling it can make you a lot of money. It'll definitely earn you more than those odd jobs you're doing. Want to give it a try?" Huang Mao stepped in closer again, continuing to egg him on. At that moment, a scene from home suddenly flashed through Zijing's mind, and his father's furious face. Zijing's chest tightened, and anger surged up in an instant. He suddenly slapped Huang Mao's hand away. "Get lost. I'm not interested." With that, he turned around and left. Huang Mao looked speechless. "This bastard. I'm thinking for his sake and he doesn't appreciate it." Just then, the man in the cap walked over. "What's so great about him anyway? Why do you keep looking out for him? Feels like he's just tall, that's all." Huang Mao replied, "He's really stubborn, but if he joins, it should be a lot of fun. As long as we sell all of this by tomorrow, your brother will give us a bonus. Right, Baek Junmyeong?" Baek Junmyeong raised his hand and took off his cap. Yeah. Meanwhile, Zijing had just gotten back home. Suddenly, a liquor bottle came flying at him. You little punk, you're only coming back now. Where the hell did you run off to? Hurry up and greet me. Seeing him like this, Zijing's face went stiff. Looked like he wouldn't be able to sleep here tonight. Should he go spend the night at the gym? At this moment, his father fixed his eyes on the gloves in his hands and asked him if he was still boxing. Jae-gyong didn't answer, and his father exploded immediately. This brat actually dared to stay silent. As he spoke, he grabbed the ashtray and hurled it straight at him. I've raised you all these years, and you dare not listen to me? You don't understand a shred of proper manners. I told you before, with the bloodline in our family, even if you learn something like boxing, in the end you'll only turn into a thug. Did you hear me? Still not answering, you stupid thing. He just kept getting beaten like that. Jae-gyong finally couldn't hold it in anymore and shoved him away. Enough. Stop talking nonsense. I will never end up like that. I will definitely succeed, and then leave this damned, rotten house. His father rushed forward and grabbed him by the hair. Fine, go ahead and try. You think that'll make you so great? Trash. There's no way you can do it. Jae-gyong just glared at him, unblinking. His father flared up even more in an instant, picked up a bottle, and smashed it toward him again. Jae-gyong didn't dodge, and he didn't fight back either. No, I'm not like my dad. I will definitely prove that I'm stronger than you. His father laughed loudly in mockery. No, Ju Jae-gyong, you can't do it. How good could your mother's genes possibly be? Don't even think about ever leaving this place in your life, or about making a name for yourself. In the end, you'll definitely end up just like me, muddling through life in a daze until you die. Do you really think someone like you can achieve anything at all? From the moment you were born, you were destined to be a loser, a piece of trash. As Ju Jae-gyong listened, his fists clenched tighter and tighter, and his whole body was shaking. If I win first prize in the competition, what will you do? Dad told him to stop talking nonsense. Even after I die, you still absolutely won't be able to do it, right? So Ju Jae-gyong looked at him and said, then let's find out. If I win the championship, you go die. On the day of the match, Ju Jae-gyong replayed his dad's words over and over in his head. He struck his opponent harder and harder, more and more viciously. The referee saw something was wrong and rushed in at once to stop him. Stop, Ju Jae-gyong. Stop, the bell has already rung. Blue corner, Ju Jae-gyong wins. This year's champion is first-year student Ju Jae-gyong from Chudong Technical High School. The director ran over in excitement and grabbed him in a hug. Kid, you took first place. He lowered his head and looked at the trophy in his hand, and Ju Jae-gyong was genuinely happy. Then he immediately turned around and ran home, bursting with excitement. Look, I won the championship. You can never say something like that again. But as soon as he stepped through the door, this was what he saw. The trophy in his hand fell to the floor with a smack. Player Ju finally walked out from the shadow of his family of origin. He booked a room, did the interior work, and started a new life. After his father passed away, Player Ju fell into a depression and later called his mother. This time, the call went through. Hearing that familiar voice on the other end, Player Ju hesitated for a moment. He still called out Mom and told her he was Ju Jae-gyong. Hearing it was Ju Jae-gyong, his mother also froze for a moment, a bit surprised. Player Ju told his mother that his father had already passed away. So, now can you come back and live with me? I've saved up a lot of money from my part-time jobs. At that moment, the sound of a child crying came from the other end of the line. His mother told Jae-gyong that she had already remarried, so there was no way she could live with him. Let's just live our own separate lives. You're already grown up, aren't you? Don't contact me again. After saying this, she hung up the phone on the spot, and Player Ju's whole body trembled. He just stood there blankly on the spot. He thought of that time in the phone booth when he called his mother before, and in that moment he shed the same sorrowful tears. He suddenly smashed his phone onto the ground. Then he stomped on it hard over and over. From then on, the director never saw Player Ju come to train again. He started hanging around with those drifting street punks. After going through all this, he completely gave up on himself. That day, the blonde guy pulled out that thing again and asked Player Ju if he really wasn't going to sell. Everyone says the more you sell, the more you make. How long are you going to stay this broke? Just try it once and see. But Player Ju still refused. At that moment, Baek Junmyeong walked over. Forget it. Don't bother with this coward. It's his own loss. As he spoke, he bumped into Player Ju. Big bro takes such good care of you. Treats you to meals, treats you to drinks. Shouldn't you pay him back a little? If it weren't for bro, 53 would have beaten you to a pulp a long time ago. Player Ju's eyes were so fierce it was like he was ready to kill someone. Baek Junmyeong, however, wasn't afraid at all. and even told him that he had learned fighting too. A piece of trash who thinks he's amazing, full of trash who think they're amazing, plus a whole bunch of trouble. Later on, he got into a fight with a classmate and even damaged public property, and player Ju was taken to the police station. No matter when, I would always stay by his side. The director received a call from the police and rushed over immediately. The police asked him, "Are you the guardian of the student Ju Jaegyong?" The officer clearly explained the situation from beginning to end. Because they couldn't reach an appropriate guardian, they could only call the emergency contact who lived nearby. As soon as the director arrived, he landed a punch on player Ju. "You bastard! Is this how I taught you?" After leading him out, the director glared at him and asked, "Are you going to keep living like this?" Player Ju didn't even look back. "None of your business." Seeing his attitude, the director got even angrier. "Idiot! Get a grip. Do you want to turn out exactly like your dad? If your mom saw you like this now, how could she possibly still want to live with you again?" Hearing this, player Ju exploded on the spot. He rushed up, grabbed the director by the collar, and cursed, "Don't say that kind of thing." The director shot back, "Did I say anything wrong? Answer me." For a moment, player Ju couldn't get a word out. The next second, the director's fist slammed into his stomach. "How dare you just grab your teacher's collar like that?" Ju Jaegyong returned to the training hall. "You said you wanted to make money, didn't you? You don't necessarily have to box. Mixed martial arts pays better these days. You could try going down that path. You've learned boxing, so you'll pick it up quickly. I know the owner of an MMA gym. I can introduce you. Your dad's not weak, but he took the wrong path. That was his own choice. Don't become like him. If even you are like this, my mom will be very sad up in heaven. You definitely don't know how much it hurt her the first time my mom saw you, wearing only a vest, thin as a skeleton. That's why, compared to the other kids, she took extra special care of you." Back home, player Zhou stayed silent for a long time. Mi also remembered those days when she herself was training as a child, her father's blows, and the coach's encouragement. Only later did he slowly manage to stand back up again. He went to the sports center and went straight to look for the coach. "Thank you so much for this whole time. I'm leaving." After saying that, he gave the coach a deep bow. The coach smiled in relief. "All right, now get lost. You're not allowed to come back here again." The coach told Jim Dan that that was the last time he spoke with Ju Jaegyong, and that this time was the first time he had seen Ju Jaegyong since then. After listening to the whole story, Jim Dan was completely stunned. So something like that had happened in the past. "I really had no idea that player Zhou went through all that as a kid." Player Zhou is not someone who would talk about this kind of thing. Even if he did, he'd only be ignored or pitted, and he must hate that feeling. The people in that sports center now probably don't know either. By this point, he was tired too, so he had Jim Dan take him back. And at this moment, player Zhou was sitting in his room, also thinking about the past. After leaving the sports center, he went to the fighting gym. As soon as he walked in, his gaze was caught by the scene before him. The fighters inside were training. At this moment, Nam UK looked up. "Who are you? Are you new here?" It turned out that player Zhou's curse started right here. It was like a kind of formulaic superstition. Only after trying mixed martial arts did player Zhou realize this really did suit him better than boxing. As for how he performed in the cage, the other fighters were dumbfounded. No one expected him to pick things up so quickly. Nam UK also immediately saw player Zhou's potential. If they kept training that kid down this path, he would sooner or later turn into a monster. After a period of training, player Zhou officially made his debut in a Korean mixed martial arts tournament. Everyone was looking forward to this new face, and the other fighters generally thought highly of him. He won his first match, and player Zhou instantly became the center of attention. But as the event went on, each opponent was stronger than the last. Player Zhou lost. Nam UK couldn't figure out why either. Was player Zhou just too nervous? His emotional swings were way too extreme. After he lost, player Zhou felt off in every part of his body. What kept flashing through his mind, over and over, were the scenes of his father tearing him down. In the next 5 fights, player Zhou kept losing one after another. Back at the gym, he just exploded. He simply couldn't believe it. He had actually lost 5 in a row. He'd clearly been winning so smoothly at first, so where on earth had it gone wrong? "I've been training myself to the limit, so why do I keep losing?" Seeing him making such a scene, the fighters beside him reminded him, "This isn't your personal gym. It's normal for fight results to be less than ideal. Just work harder next time. The fighter for the next bout needs to use the space. You should head out." At this moment, player Zhou noticed that an older senior over there was murmuring something under his breath. He walked over and asked the senior what he was doing. The senior said that he reads the Bible every time on the day before a match. Only then will his results be good. He feels that this can calm his mind, That's my little superstition. Don't all players have their own superstitions? Because your mental state really can be heavily affected by the competition. Player Zhou thought of himself and was not sure if the pressure of the competition was too great. He would always dream of his father on the day before the match. That person seemed like, even after dying, he still had to come and drag him down. That day, Player Zhou suddenly jolted awake from his dream. This time, he really couldn't get back to sleep. Suddenly, the door was pushed open, and a few players ran in and pulled Player Zhou out to have fun. Player Zhou said he still had a match tomorrow, but after all their persuasion, Player Zhou still went along with them, and it was there that he met a gaming friend. The next day, when Player Zhou opened his eyes, he was instead stunned. When did I fall asleep? It was clearly the day before the match, yet it felt like he had slept especially well. After that, he went to compete, and he actually won. Player Zhou was even more baffled. Why? His opponent was not weak, so it could only be because of yesterday. Afterward, he tried playing games a few more times before matches. He couldn't clearly explain the reason, but that's just how the results turned out. From that day on, Player Zhou began to repeatedly recreate the day before that winning match, especially playing games, which could completely clear his mind. He did not particularly care about those gaming friends either. It obviously felt like a superstition, but as long as he followed the routine, he could relax. These actions really seemed to give him a push psychologically. Later, his habits kept increasing bit by bit. In competitions, he also racked up a streak of consecutive wins. On this day, Nam UK approached Player Zhou. Zijing, can we talk for a moment? With your ability, just staying in the domestic scene is really a waste. How about leaving here and opening a sports center that belongs only to you? Compared to being an athlete myself, I'd rather stand by your side and give you a push, you, a rising star of tomorrow. Let me help you. You're sure to win a world championship. We'll write a new chapter of history together. Later, the new sports center really was established. Player Zhou's strength also kept surging higher, again and again. Over the years, he has won so many trophies that they can't even be counted. He stepped straight onto the peak of his career. Of course, that kind of daily training pushed to the absolute extreme never stopped for even a moment. In the end, he finally made his official debut on the world stage. Player Zhou knew very clearly what habit had pushed him here. That kind of little game that could instantly quiet the thoughts that turned his mind into a tangled mess. That glass of milk he had to drink every morning, and the perfume he had to spray after taking a shower. This was his winning formula. Even he felt it was ridiculously superstitious, and he had to believe in these things with his eyes closed in order to win a match. He would rather die than accept defeat. As long as he possessed this level of strength, this fame, and this money, absolutely no one would dare look down on him. No one would see him as a loser. He had to keep winning. Then he remembered that day, when he accompanied the director on a walk. The director asked Player Zhou what he planned to do next. He only said, "I'm going to reclaim the championship throne." The curator pressed him, "And after that, when you become a champion, do you think life will actually get better?" The curator went on to tell him, "The so-called champion's throne is not your whole life. It's precisely because you treat it as everything that the moment you lose, it feels as if the whole world has collapsed. You care far too little about the people and things around you. If you keep charging around with that rotten temper, in the end you'll definitely lose everyone. Do you really want to, once again, end up all alone? There must be something whose importance is no less than winning in competition. You have to see what that is before your life can truly become happy. Think it over carefully. As long as you really look at what's around you, you'll definitely find it. That will become another goal in your life." Listening to the curator, Player Zhou suddenly saw Jim Dan's face flash through his mind. The next second, he jolted awake from the dream. Player Zhou finally admitted it, his feelings for Jim Dan. Turned out that, for him, Jim Dan was more important than the competition. Player Zhou lay in bed, coughing nonstop. He thought again of what the curator had said, something more important than the competition. And the first thing that came to his mind was actually Jim Dan. From the past up to now, he had never talked about romance with anyone, because in his eyes, that would only drag down his future and be an unnecessary burden. But now that he thinks about it carefully again, at first he was just curious, but as time went on, the more he wanted to hold on tightly to Jim Dan. Because Jim Dan could help him win, he kept treating Jim Dan as a tool and kept him by his side. As long as Jim Dan failed to function like a tool and showed any sign of weakness, he would instantly fly into a rage. He didn't ask Jim Dan why he had become like that, because to him, his own affairs were more important. But as everything started to deviate more and more from his plan, he began to panic, and the anger that arose from this completely surged to its peak the moment he heard they would have to compete again. But mixed in with this anger, there seemed to be some other emotion, one that even I myself couldn't clearly name. What exactly was it? Was it that the moment I thought Jim Dan might disappear from my side, I became afraid? This sense of urgency is the truth I've been running from, the truth I've refused to admit. Thinking of this, I feel like my head is about to explode. During this period, I've been staring at the matches like I've gone mad, and everything I've done to Jim Dan resurfaces in my mind, scene after scene. Only now do I understand, but it's already too late. At this moment, Player Zhou only feels cold all over. His head is starting to spin as well. He has no idea what he should do from now on. Is there still time to make things right? Just then, in a daze, he sees Jim Dan as if he's right in front of him. Player Zhou immediately props himself up on the ground and crawls to his feet. But when he focuses his eyes, there's nothing there at all. So, he's even started seeing hallucinations. The next day, Grandpa came over to look for Jim Dan. Ask him if he will come back very late today as well. Let's stew a chicken tonight and add some abalone to eat together. Jim Dan told Grandpa that he would come back early today. So Grandpa told him to also call over that young man from the Ming family. If he was at home, they would eat together. Ever since they ran into each other at the market last time, they hadn't seen him again. Had he gone back to the capital? But his car was still parked here, so Jim Dan felt he probably hadn't gone back. Grandpa found it even stranger. Then why had they never seen him? Had he been staying home all this time? Jim Dan thought of the time he had seen him at the hospital before. Back then, he seemed to be sick. He hadn't come to the hospital these past few days either. Jim Dan told Grandpa that he would go over and check on him after getting off work. That night, Player Zhou saw Jim Dan standing by the sea. His face was covered in tears, and he was just looking at him like that. Player Zhou was startled. He asked him where he was going. Jim Dan did not answer. He simply turned around and walked into the sea. Step by step, Player Zhou immediately ran after him. The next second, he suddenly sat up in bed. He was gasping for air, and only then did he realize it had just been a dream. He felt that something was wrong. He had been lying in bed for days, yet he hadn't gotten any better at all. He only felt so cold that he was trembling. He had suffered so much hardship as a child, yet he had never been this sick. It didn't feel like a cold. Then what on earth was it? Just then, he heard someone come in. In a daze, he saw Jim Dan again. He thought it was another hallucination. This time, Player Zhou reached out and grabbed him directly. Don't leave again. Jim Dan turned his head, his face full of question marks. That real feeling of actually grabbing someone in his hand made Player Zhou freeze on the spot. He immediately let go of Jim Dan. He hadn't expected. This time it really wasn't a dream. You look like you're sick. I was afraid something might happen to you, so I came to check on you. You still look really bad right now. And the door wasn't even locked. Wait here a moment. After Jim Dan said that, he went out. Player Zhou stood there in a daze for a long time, still rooted to the spot. When he went out to have a look, he found that Jim Dan was cooking. For a moment, Player Zhou didn't know how to start speaking. He asked Jim Dan what he was doing, and Jim Dan said, cooking chicken porridge with the leftover chicken from dinner. Then Jim Dan asked him, have you eaten anything these past few days? Player Zhou said, there's no need to go this far. When did I ever ask you to do all this? As soon as the words left his mouth, Player Zhou realized he shouldn't have said it that way. Jim Dan was silent for a moment. Even though you didn't ask me to. But when you're sick, if no one takes care of you and you're all alone, wouldn't you feel really miserable? I'll go back once I finish cooking this. Player Zhou looked at Jim Dan's back as he cooked for him. The next second, he went straight up and hugged him. Even though he had always treated Jim Dan so badly, all of a sudden, he remembered how he had managed to live all the way until now. His only goal was just to stay alive. In order to stay alive, he absolutely had to win. No matter what happened, he only ever thought about himself. But now, I still can't win against Jim Dan. Player Zhou leaned against the wall and said nothing. At this moment, he had no choice but to admit it. In this confrontation with Jim Dan, he had lost and lost completely. Because of Jim Dan, Player Zhou had really started to change. Now, he was also starting to be considerate of Jim Dan in everything. That day, Player Zhou got up very early. After getting ready, he went out for a morning run. Just a few days ago, he had been so sick he couldn't get out of bed, as if it had all been a dream. But now he was almost recovered. Maybe the suffocating blockage in his heart had finally been cleared away. Maybe, thanks to Jim Dan's help, he was able to get better. After the fever went down, Player Zhou's thoughts also became clear. To him, Jim Dan was no longer something as simple as just superstition. Jim Dan had sunk very deep into his life. In everything Jim Dan did, he gave it his all. Yet he himself had made such a Jim Dan choose to leave. He had even personally destroyed him. Now the only one who had gotten better was himself. But Jim Dan had not. By now, He couldn't even remember what Jim Dan's smile looked like. Superstition and all that could be put aside for now. What mattered most now was getting Jim Dan to accept treatment. Then Player Zhou went to Jim Dan's home. Seeing Player Zhou come over, Jim Dan was also a little surprised. And Grandpa had heard that Player Zhou had been sick. Grandpa was worried about him too. "Are you feeling better now?" Player Zhou said he was fine, then felt something was off. "Are you guys going out?" Grandpa nodded. "Yeah. Today Jim Dan said he'd go help with farm work. We're just about to head out. If you don't have any plans today, come along too." As soon as Jim Dan heard that, he hurried to tell Grandpa that Player Zhou shouldn't overexert himself yet. But Player Zhou said it was fine, that he'd go get ready and come over right away to go together. Hearing this, Jim Dan was a little surprised. Then they arrived at the vegetable field. Player Zhou worked until he was drenched in sweat, his back completely soaked. "Old man, why are you growing so much all by yourself?" Grandpa sighed and said, "They're already planted. What else can I do?" Grandpa also told him to come help again next year and said he'd pay him. Player Zhou refused on the spot. "I'm not coming, no need." Once they had pretty much finished the work, Grandpa bought them ice pops and told them to hurry back and rest. As for the work that was left, he and the villagers could handle it. So Jim Dan and Player Zhou went back to the yard, sat together under the tree, eating their ice pops and catching their breath. During this, Player Zhou turned his head and glanced at Jim Dan beside him. Jim Dan kept not talking to him. The air suddenly became a bit awkward. Jim Dan spoke first and asked if he was feeling any better. Player Zhou turned toward him and told him he was fully recovered. After hearing that, Jim Dan finally felt relieved. Then Player Zhou said to him again, "I've already scheduled the competition in autumn. Once I'm done tidying things up here, I'll go back to Seoul." Jim Dan's heart sank, and his voice grew faint. "Oh really?" Player Zhou told him to go back together as well. "You need to assist me in the matches, and you also need to go to the hospital for treatment. If you stay here alone, something will happen again." Jim Dan said in a low voice, "In my current state, even if I go back with you, I won't be of any help. The sleep disorder, I'll go get treatment on my own." The only thing he heard Player Zhou say was, "It's enough if you go to the hospital for treatment." Player Zhou added another line, "As for assisting me, put that aside for now. We'll start again later. After all, I'm also responsible for you ending up like this." Jim Dan lifted his eyes and looked at Player Zhou standing in front of him. His chest suddenly tightened, and he couldn't tell what it was. Still, he told Player Zhou, "This is my body. How are you responsible for it? Besides, if I'm not working, then I have no reason to go back with you." Player Zhou took a step forward, stared at him, and asked, "Do you hate the idea of going back with me that much?" "It's not that I hate it. I just feel that I'll become a burden to you, and it will make me very uncomfortable too. Also, I can't understand why you would be so considerate of me to this extent. You weren't this kind of person before. You don't have to force yourself for my sake. Don't worry about me anymore. Just go back. I'll keep paying off the debt so you don't have to worry." Hearing this from Jim Dan, Player Zhou was stunned on the spot. That Jim Dan would refuse was actually not a surprise to Player Zhou. He knew very well that he had brought all of this on himself. After a moment of silence, Player Zhou said to Jim Dan, "I told you before, right? You only need to help me with this comeback match and then the title match against Baek Junmyong after that. Just these 2 fights. Then I'll wipe out all the money you owe me in one stroke. I'll also drive you back and forth between Grandma's hospital and Seoul, up until that time. After that, you can do whatever you want. As long as the debt is paid off, I won't keep holding on to you. On that day, our contract will be over." After coming back together with Fighter Ju, Jim Dan still felt very ill at ease. When they heard that Jim Dan was going back, the nurses all felt it was a pity for him and chased after him asking, "You'll keep coming to stay with your grandma, right? You have to come play often, okay?" When Grandma heard that Jim Dan was going back to Seoul, she instead smiled happily. But Jim Dan still asked, "Grandma, are you really going to be okay?" Grandma said of course it's fine. "Anyway, you'll be coming again this weekend. Hurry and set off and make sure to receive treatment properly too." Before leaving, Fighter Ju still went to the director's hospital room. The director frowned. "You could have just left. Why did you specially come to see me?" Fighter Ju said, "If I leave without coming to say goodbye, you'll definitely nag me without end. I'll come again this weekend." As soon as the director heard that, he immediately blew up. "What are you coming for? Go train." He shoved a notebook into Fighter Ju's hands again. "Take this." Fighter Ju was stunned. "What's this?" The director said, "I've been recording your habits since you were a kid. You're always too impatient. Whenever you feel you're at a disadvantage, you forget your basic stance and just rush in to brawl head-on. It's the same now. Read it and steady your fundamentals again. You are not like your dad, so put in proper effort for me." Player Zhou nodded obediently. Okay. The next second, the director yelled at him again. If you take this, then don't come back. You're this disobedient and still want to keep coming? Getting scolded like that, player Zhou's mood sank as well. Why are you talking like this again? After that, he and Jim Dan went back to Grandpa's place to pack their luggage. When Jim Dan was saying goodbye to the puppies, Grandpa asked player Zhou, "Do you want to take a puppy back to raise?" Player Zhou said he was too busy and really had no time to keep one. When they were about to leave, Grandpa stood at the door and waved to them. Jim Dan also gave Grandpa a deep bow. The dogs kept chasing after them relentlessly from behind. After they returned to the gym, all the athletes were stunned for a moment, then immediately exploded with joy. They swarmed forward and surrounded Jim Dan. Someone hurriedly asked, "Have you come back to the training gym? You're not going to some other place again this time, right?" Looking at them, Jim Dan stated directly, "I'll be coming back and continuing to help player Zhou prepare for the competition." Everyone was instantly overjoyed, scrambling to get Jim Dan to give them massages, and even running to the coach to suggest holding a welcome party for Jim Dan. Seeing them crowding around Jim Dan so tightly that not even water could get through, player Zhou's expression darkened. "Have you all forgotten who the director of this gym is?" At this moment, Potato ran over, and the instant he saw Jim Dan, his eyes turned red. "Therapist, I really missed you so much." Jim Dan had just come back, and Potato kept hugging him without letting go, as if afraid he would disappear again. The coach walked over and reminded them, "The therapist will feel uncomfortable. Let go quickly." Then he turned to Jim Dan and said, "I'll have to ask you again this time too." To be honest, their enthusiasm was as strong as ever. At that moment, player Zhou walked over and directly pulled those few people away. "Are you tired of living? Tighten up your nerves and go train right now." The few of them even thought player Zhou was jealous, feeling like he'd been left out. So they laughed and asked, "Do you want a hug too?" In the end, player Zhou just snapped at them and drove them off. The coach at the side looked at player Zhou, then turned to look at Jim Dan. He couldn't shake the feeling that the atmosphere between them really had changed. That night, after they returned to player Zhou's home again, Jim Dan couldn't tell what he was feeling inside. The moment he walked into the room, he froze on the spot. He hadn't expected Grandma's cabinet to actually appear here again, even though he had personally moved it out before, planning to throw it away. Player Zhou told him that he had brought it back himself. "If you throw this out, you'll definitely complain later that you have nowhere to put your clothes and it'll just annoy me." Jim Dan listened with a confused face. "Me? But I don't even have that many clothes." But since player Zhou was willing to bring it back, Jim Dan was still very grateful. He told player Zhou that when he leaves, he'll take it away with him. After finishing his shower and coming out, Jim Dan saw that player Zhou was still busy, so he told him to go to bed too. "You must be tired as well." Player Zhou replied, "Let's sleep together." Jim Dan said then he would go get ready now. Zhou turned around and stopped him at once, explaining that he didn't mean it that way. He asked Jim Dan if he had forgotten. The doctor had said that Jim Dan had somnambulism, so that was why they needed to sleep together. Jim Dan felt uncomfortable all over and wanted to go back to his own room to sleep, but Zhou told him to stop nagging and just go to sleep. "If you get up and wander around again in the middle of the night, someone has to be there to grab you." After Jim Dan said goodnight to Zhou, he turned around and went straight to sleep. Zhou looked completely speechless. "Does he hate me that much? That's really annoying." Right after that, he heard Jim Dan's steady breathing. Strange. Did he fall asleep so fast because he took medicine? Zhou could also understand how uneasy Jim Dan felt. But for now, there really was no other way. Compared to another accident happening, this was better. It seemed Zhou was truly very afraid of Jim Dan leaving. He even dreamed about it in his sleep. The next day, Zhou slowly opened his eyes, only to find that Jim Dan beside him had disappeared. He woke up instantly, shot up from the bed, and rushed outside in big strides. As soon as he came out, he saw Jim Dan making breakfast in the kitchen. Zhou was breathing heavily. Hearing the noise, Jim Dan turned his head. "Zhou, you're awake." He paused, then added, "Breakfast is almost ready." Catching his breath, Zhou said, "I thought you were gone again." Jim Dan didn't quite catch that, froze for a moment, and wondered what he meant. Zhou said it was nothing. After a while, breakfast was ready and set out. Jim Dan said to him, "Since you're preparing for the competition, I paid special attention to the dishes." Zhou looked at him. "Aren't you eating?" Jim Dan said he usually didn't really eat breakfast. Zhou insisted that he eat together. "You'll only have energy if you eat." Then he lowered his voice and added, "You must be really hungry too." Jim Dan still said it was fine, but his stomach was very honest. The next second it growled loudly, Gork, Joe immediately stood up and gave his seat to him. He even filled a big bowl of rice for him and set it right in front of him. This time Jim Dan really couldn't refuse. He could only obediently eat. Halfway through the meal, Joe kept stealing glances at him, feeling that Jim Dan seemed even thinner than before. Eating so little every day, of course he wouldn't put on any weight, so Joe simply said, "Take bigger bites." Jim Dan nodded obediently and did as he was told. In no time, both of Jim Dan's cheeks were puffed up, stuffed full of rice. Joe couldn't help but let out a laugh, and a word popped into his mind. Like a hamster. The next second he suddenly realized, had he just laughed while watching Jim Dan eat? It felt a bit like self-mockery, but also like acceptance. "Looks like I've softened up too." Then he urged Jim Dan to finish all the rice, not to leave any, and then go to the gym to train. The sparring partners were almost at their limit. The coach walked over, saw that Joe was in pretty good shape, and even asked with concern, "Your shoulder is okay now, right?" Joe said, "It should be fully recovered." Then he planned to keep practicing extra with Jose and the coach. At that moment, he heard some noise beside him. When he looked up, he saw Jim Dan treating other players. After a round of massage from Jim Dan, the player immediately felt much better. The person, excited, rushed up to hug Jim Dan, thanking him again and again. Just then, player Joe came over in a temper and cut them off. In a cold voice, he told Jim Dan to come with him. The two of them went all the way into the treatment room. Player Joe questioned Jim Dan, "Why are you treating other people? Before, after you finish treating me, you would use the remaining time to take a look at them as well." Player Joe directly warned him, "Don't ever do that again." Jim Dan looked completely puzzled. "But there are still players waiting outside. I'm just helping them with treatment." The more player Joe listened, the angrier he became. He turned away, suppressing his temper. "You only need to treat me. You were hired in the first place because of me, so why don't you listen to me and instead go do those unnecessary things?" Frightened stiff by him, Jim Dan could only lower his voice and say he understood. Player Joe stared at him and then asked why he always looked so timid. Just then there was a knock on the door, and the coach reminded Player Joe that his break was over and told him to come out. Player Joe had no choice but to go out first. Jim Dan stood there in a daze, his mind in complete chaos. How on earth was he supposed to cooperate with Player Joe? Even if he did things the way he used to, Joe still wasn't satisfied. He had absolutely no idea what Player Joe actually wanted him to do. And that furious look on Player Joe's face, he just couldn't forget it. It was terrifying. When he went to sleep that night, Joe thought again of that scene in the gymnasium. Obviously, it shouldn't have made him that angry, but he still lost his temper at Jim Dan. Wasn't that just the same as before? But it was really strange. As long as I see someone touch Jim Dan, I just can't control myself. The more he thought about it, the more chaotic his mind became, and Joe soon got sleepy. He had been getting sleepy far too easily lately. Clearly, in the past, as long as someone was lying next to him, he couldn't fall asleep. How strange. He turned his head to the side and glanced again at Jim Dan lying next to him. He reminded himself silently in his heart, "Tomorrow I absolutely have to hold it in. Don't lose my temper." The next morning, Joe's eyes flew open. As soon as he sat up, he realized Jim Dan was gone again. He immediately rushed out to look for him, running until he was out of breath. Jim Dan turned his head, saw Joe, and just like the previous morning, greeted him. Joe leaned against the wall and caught his breath first. "Why did you run out again without saying a word? Why did you run out again without saying a word?" Seeing him like this, Jim Dan couldn't help but laugh. The next second, Joe jolted awake. Only then did he realize that scene just now had been a dream. But when he turned around, he then discovered Jim Dan was really gone. He immediately lifted the quilt and got up, rushing straight out of the room. And then he saw Jim Dan sleepwalking. Just as Jim Dan was about to fall off the edge of the railing, Joe rushed forward just in time and grabbed him. Then he yanked hard, pulling him back with a strong tug. "Really? That was almost an accident." At this moment, Jim Dan was still murmuring, as if apologizing to Player Joe. Seeing Jim Dan in this state, only then did Player Joe understand. After Jim Dan came back here, he hadn't gotten any better at all. Things couldn't go on like this. In order not to let Jim Dan refuse his kind offer to buy him clothes, Player Joe actually lied and said these clothes were all given as sponsorship. After bringing the still sleepwalking Jim Dan back to the room, Player Joe just stayed by his side like that, not taking a single step away. He had never thought that one day he would become like this, staring at someone while they slept. Jim Dan's condition was terribly bad, but even in this state, he still finished his work seriously. Player Joe saw it all, and his heart grew heavier. He must be forcing himself to hold on. Then he stood up and opened Jim Dan's wardrobe, only to find there were barely any clothes inside. Strange. Does he not even have money to buy clothes? Player Zhou remembered that when he was a child, he had worn clothes other people didn't want. But what about Jim Dan? Is it that he really can't bear to spend money on himself? Because Player Zhou knew that Jim Dan was never well off to begin with, he became even more determined. He had to do something for Jim Dan. He couldn't let Jim Dan suddenly disappear again. Early the next morning, Player Zhou asked Jim Dan, "What plans do you have today?" Jim Dan said, "I'm going to the training center with you later." Why? But Zhou still said he wasn't going to the training gym today and wanted Jim Dan to stay at home with him. Jim Dan was startled on the spot. Right after that, Zhou stepped closer. "If you're free today, then keep me company and play with me." Jim Dan looked at him and asked, "Is it playing video games with you?" As soon as Zhou heard that, he bristled. "Do you think that's the only thing on my mind?" Then, following Zhou's suggestion, the two of them took out the Monopoly set from last time again. Zhou even asked him, "Didn't you say you like this?" Jim Dan stared at those toys and said softly, "Rather than saying I like it, it's more that I didn't know what you would like before, so I prepared it." Zhou was stunned. But he still reached out and pulled Jim Dan over to sit beside him and play together. Yet as they played, Jim Dan stayed very calm. Even when Zhou won the game and got wildly excited, Jim Dan still didn't really react. Zhou looked at him sitting there with that "so bored I'm spacing out" expression. He was even more confused. Last time Jim Dan had so much fun. So why is it that this time Zhou wants to play again, but Jim Dan seems not to care at all? Jim Dan pierced it with one sentence. "You play video games with me just because my health is bad, right?" But Zhou wouldn't admit it, and his tone was steady. "That's not it. Didn't you used to say this yourself? No matter how busy you are, you have to take one day off every week. So I'm only taking a rest today." He stared at Jim Dan. "What about you? Have you ever actually gotten any real rest? Not long ago you were in the countryside, so busy you weren't even sleeping. After coming here, you've been working non-stop." Just then the doorbell suddenly rang. The person outside was from the laundry shop. Player Zhou stood up and went over to open the door. The next second, he came back in carrying a huge pile of clothes. Jim Dan stared, his whole face full of shock. Player Zhou casually asked, "You wear size XX, right? Your clothes are too old, so wear these instead." Jim Dan was completely stunned, not even knowing where to put his hands. "These aren't all for me, right? How much do these cost?" Player Zhou even deliberately coaxed him. "They're not bought. They're sponsored. The brand didn't say anything beforehand and suddenly sent over the sizes. I was really troubled too." He pushed the clothes toward him. "You can wear them right now." Jim Dan stared at that pile of new clothes, his throat tightening. He looked up and asked Player Zhou, "Then what about my original clothes?" Player Zhou said calmly, "I threw them away. Weren't they all old? The gray hoodie you wear every day, and the t-shirts, all of them also." Jim Dan suddenly cut him off, his voice turning anxious in an instant. "No, the gray hoodie was a gift from my grandma, a high school graduation present." The next second, Jim Dan spun around and rushed to the trash bin to dig through it. Fortunately, he found it. Player Zhou stood next to him, his expression hard to describe. He had almost made another mistake. Jim Dan stood up with the coat in his hand and said quietly to Player Zhou, "You actually don't have to be this nice to me. You even look after me on rest days and give me these clothes. It all makes me feel unworthy. Anyway, once we finish playing these 2 matches, we'll go our separate ways, so don't keep me in your mind. Just treat me like you did before. I'll quietly live my own life." After hearing this, Player Zhou just froze on the spot. Strange. Could he have gotten the direction wrong? He had thought that as long as he filled the material gap, that would be enough. He then told Jim Dan to take the clothes and wear them, saying that he couldn't wear them anyway. The size was too small. Jim Dan thanked him very politely. In the next second, he was called over to the pool again by Player Zhou. Player Zhou told Jim Dan to pick a pair of swim trunks from that pile of clothes and change into them. But Jim Dan said he didn't know how to swim. To his surprise, Player Zhou said calmly, "I'll teach you." Seeing the disbelief all over Jim Dan's face, Player Zhou stared at him and asked, "You don't trust me? If you space out in the sea until you come back to your senses, as long as you know how to swim, you can make it back to shore on your own. This is something you must have. Learn it." Under this almost lavish style of care from Player Zhou, Jim Dan's body also recovered pretty much completely in a short time. After finishing his swimming lesson, Jim Dan flopped straight onto the sofa, his eyelids heavy with sleep. Player Zhou came over and told him to go back to his room to sleep. But Jim Dan said there was no need. He was worried that if he slept now, he wouldn't be able to sleep at night. Probably because he had just been swimming and had also eaten too much. Player Zhou recalled how he had just forced him to eat. Just tell him, you have to eat this much so you can get better faster. At this moment, Jim Dan suddenly said thank you to him. Player Zhou was taken aback and asked him what he was thanking him for. Jim Dan said softly, you hardly rested at all today. You've been worrying about me the whole time. Thanks to you, I actually rested very well. I feel like I should be able to sleep very soundly tonight. So Player Zhou told Jim Dan to first have a good sleep and to get back to work seriously after waking up. He then asked Jim Dan, next time you take a break, what else would you like to do? Jim Dan looked completely puzzled. Player Zhou pressed on, aren't you supposed to take regular breaks? I'm asking you, what do you want to do? Jim Dan said, there's nothing I particularly want to do. So Player Zhou told Jim Dan to come up with something himself. He went on to ask about several options in a row, but Jim Dan hadn't done a single one of them. After chatting like this with Player Zhou for a while, Jim Dan grew more and more sleepy. In the end, he still couldn't hold on and wanted to take a quick nap first. He even said he was going to tough it out. But if you drag it out that late, how could you possibly fall asleep? Player Zhou considerately brought over a blanket and gently covered Jim Dan with it. Then he just sat next to him and kept him company, watching Jim Dan sleep soundly. Player Zhou couldn't help it. The corners of his mouth slowly lifted. He felt this worked even better than going to the doctor. Just like that, it went on until the next morning. Player Zhou was still by Jim Dan's side. Looks like he just fell asleep here last night. Jim Dan continued helping him with the treatment. Afterward, Zhou went with Jim Dan to the hospital to visit his grandmother. They then went to his grandfather's place and ate there. Gradually, Jim Dan's condition also started to get better bit by bit. That day, Zhou was in his room, staring at the birthday present Jim Dan had given him back then. He kept wondering, what on earth was the sentence that Jim Dan crossed out at the end and never wrote down? Just as he was lost in thought, Jim Dan suddenly opened the door and said it was time to eat. Zhou reacted quickly and hid the thing at once. Without realizing it, the day of his comeback match was almost here. That day, in the gymnasium, the atmosphere was as cold as a knife. Jim Dan said he kept feeling like the air pressure here was especially low. The blonde guy told him it was probably because the coaches were working out the game strategy. The opponent this time was Arnaud Gabriel, a tough French fighter ranked among the top in light heavyweight kickboxing. So his strength absolutely couldn't be underestimated. But what he was most famous for was that outrageously handsome face. He had even just edged out Jing Ji to take first place on the list of world's most handsome athletes. So everyone's eyes were full of killing intent. Can we lose the match? No, there's no way we can let him steal that spot. At this moment, in the conference room, Zhou's manager and staff were busy to the point of flying. They were still muttering, we absolutely can't let our beauty be overshadowed by Gabriel. What on earth are you all talking about? This totally ridiculous stuff. A female staff member asked how tall Gabriel was, and the coach immediately replied, Jing is taller than him on height. We've already won this round. They were still arguing endlessly over this trivial matter, and Player Zhou was getting a headache. Does it really need such a big production? Can't we just do it the usual way? The next second, he was collectively shot down by the group. As long as Player Injing focuses on preparing for the match, that's enough, we'll handle everything else. Even his morale as Player Zhu Zhejiang has to be world champion level. Even his handsomeness as Player Zhu Zhejiang has to be world champion level. The coach also earnestly twisted the knife. That's right, Injing. Objectively speaking, I think your ability is stronger. Just keep training as usual so this kind of event won't affect the match. Player Zhou let out a sigh and lowered his voice. Anyone who dares interfere with my match can try it. I'll throw every last one of you out. Understand? A few people immediately answered in unison. Understood. Finally, the day of the comeback match was almost here. Everyone got their things together and prepared to set off. On the way, Jim Dan was so nervous that his palms were cold and clammy. Player Zhou was also silently psyching himself up. Yeah, let's go. Player Zhou's liver fire is really blazing. If he's not losing his temper, then he's on his way to losing his temper. In this period before the match, Player Zhou is also so busy he basically can't stop. Autograph sessions, events one after another, wherever he goes, he's the center of attention. On this day, Player Zhou was holding back his anger in his heart. Do they really have to go this far? The makeup artists and stylists said, of course, this is the minimum standard. If you don't want to lose to Player Gabriel, you have to do this. Look at this, the stylist added. Player Gabriel will be wearing this kind of suit at the press conference this time. They've prepared very thoroughly too. How could Player Zhu Zhejiang lose to him in terms of presence? Player Zhou was so mad he wanted to start cursing. Isn't it just appearance rankings? What's so important about that? Just wearing a random t-shirt wouldn't make a difference. The coach beside him held him back. The fans are looking forward to this so much. How can you do that? The team representative also made it clear that you have to dress up properly for the press conference. After all, it's your comeback match. The fans will be happy to see it. After saying that, he even followed up and asked therapist Jim Dan. You agree, right? At this moment, player Zhou also shifted his gaze over, and Jim Dan actually nodded, agreeing with what the coach said. Player Zhou was so angry he ground his teeth, and could only urge the makeup artist. Hurry up and finish. In just 6 more days, it will be held in Paris, France. Today's main event is the first face-to-face interview between players Arnaud Gabriel and Zhu Zhejiang. With the host's introduction, Arnaud Gabriel from the blue corner entered first. A wave of praise surged up all at once, completely unstoppable. Contestant Zhou in the audience watched this scene, completely speechless. What on earth were they acting out? The stylist next to him still remembered to pat him and cheer him on. At this moment, it was contestant Zhou's turn to go on stage. The moment he stepped on stage, the whole venue exploded in screams. Even the host was stunned. Contestant Zhu Zhejiang had clearly dressed up carefully, so he could appear handsome and not lose to contestant Gabriel. It was like seeing a new side of him for the first time. You could feel it in the air. The tension between the two contestants was almost evenly matched. At this moment, contestant Gabriel praised contestant Zhou in French. Contestant Zhou couldn't understand and could only look utterly confused. Offstage, contestant Zhou's stylists were so excited they were about to jump up. They had succeeded. He wasn't overshadowed. They had to strike first to gain the upper hand. This time it would definitely blow up as a hot topic. Jim Dan just stood there, quietly watching contestant Zhou. When everyone was getting ready to leave and head back, contestant Gabriel suddenly walked over and found contestant Zhou. Contestant Zhu Zhejiang, let's have a serious match this time. This is your comeback match. You must be really looking forward to it, but I won't go easy on you. Train well, I'm heading off first. As he turned to leave, his gaze swept over Jim Dan, who was standing nearby. Gabriel suddenly came out with a line on the spot, complimenting how beautiful his eyes were. Seeing this, contestant Zhou immediately chased after the interpreter to ask what he had just said. After hearing the interpreter's words, contestant Zhou instantly exploded, rushing up as if to teach Gabriel a lesson. His coach and the other contestants hurried to stop him when they saw what was happening. Contestant Zhou felt even more at a loss inside. Was he insulting me? After that, contestant Zhou didn't dare slack off at all during training. A whole set of training was completed. The coach noticed that player Zhou got tired especially quickly today and felt something was wrong. The training content was clearly the same as in Korea, so it seemed he was still too nervous. That night, player Zhou lay on the bed, his mind still spinning with thoughts of the match. In this comeback tournament, I must deliver good results so I can take the champion's position back. I will absolutely never fall down again. When there were still 4 days left before the match, Jim Dan came to find player Zhou and said there was a bit of a situation. Originally, the coach had said they would take a day off today, let everyone relax a bit and go walk around nearby together, and everyone else had agreed. Only player Zhou cared particularly about the match. When he heard this arrangement, his face darkened. So the coach went over and patiently persuaded him at length. He finally managed to talk him around. But when it came to the next day, which is today, the coach told Jim Dan that last night he had eaten a late-night snack together with the players, and the takeaway food had probably gone bad. So everyone had diarrhea and couldn't even get out the door of their rooms. Jim Dan passed this news on to player Zhou and asked him quietly, "What do we do now?" Player Zhou thought for a moment. "What else can we do? We'll just have to go by ourselves." When Jim Dan heard that, he panicked. "Just us? Go where?" Player Zhou looked at him and said, "Anywhere is fine." After getting changed, he took Jim Dan to the most famous amusement park in the city. Looking at such a large amusement park in front of him, Jim Dan couldn't help asking, "Weren't we just going to take a simple rest?" Player Zhou said, "Just wandering around for fun." Then he asked back, "Have you ever been to this kind of place?" Hearing Jim Dan say no, player Zhou's eyes suddenly lit up. "Great. I haven't been here either. Let's go." Jim Dan thought to himself, it's definitely going to be a lot of fun. Player Zhou never expected that. He had originally thought Jim Dan would be scared of these rides, but the one who was truly afraid turned out to be himself. The two of them walked into the amusement park. Player Zhou said to Jim Dan that as they walked around, if he wanted to ride anything, he should just say so. Jim Dan asked him, "Is it really okay? What if someone recognizes you?" Anyway, no matter where he goes, he'll get recognized. And there are far fewer people who recognize him here than in Korea, so it's fine. Of course, he had to take this kind of opportunity to come out and stroll around. It was just that looking at Jim Dan's expression, It was way too calm. Player Zhou was a bit puzzled. Does Jim Dan not like this kind of place? Jim Dan said, not really, he was just a bit curious, because he had never been here before. It was also Player Zhou's first time. After hearing that, even he froze for a moment. Logically, you're supposed to come at least once on a school field trip when you're a kid. Player Zhou listened and only responded with a faint, He knew very clearly in his heart, you need money just to be able to come. Of course, Jim Dan understood that too. Then Jim Dan took the initiative to say that he would be the tour guide. All the way, Player Zhou simply followed along behind Jim Dan like that. They walked over to the rocking boat area. Jim Dan watched the people above all screaming and found it very scary. But Player Zhou didn't think so. What's so scary about it? It's not like you're gonna fall off and die. Jim Dan said he'd heard that for this kind of ride you have to raise both hands high and scream out loud for it to be fun, and asked if that was true. Player Zhou replied that that's exactly what the seniors at the gym told him. After saying that, he directly took Jim Dan to sit in the very back row. But once they actually got on, Jim Dan wasn't scared at all. The scenery was actually beautiful. At this moment, he noticed Player Zhou next to him, who was quietly acting a bit off. Jim Dan didn't figure it out right away. After they got off the ride, he hurried to ask, "Are you okay? Were you really scared?" The next second, Player Zhou immediately shot back loudly, "Scared of what? It's not scary at all." However, as soon as he shouted that, he started feeling dizzy the very next second. Then he turned his head and asked Jim Dan, "So, how was it?" Jim Dan said it was more fun than he'd imagined. But seeing that Zhou's face didn't look right, he asked if he wanted to head back first. Right then, Player Zhou stood up at once. "We're not going back. Let's go play something else." Jim Dan was a bit worried and asked if that would be pushing himself too hard. Player Zhou looked completely unwilling to admit defeat. "I can't quit here. Come with me." With that, he grabbed Jim Dan and headed straight for the souvenir shop. He raised his hand and put a headband on Jim Dan. "Today, let's go all out." Jim Dan froze. He's the only one wearing one? The young woman at the register nearby really knew what was up. The young woman at the register immediately took out another one. "That'll be 40 euros in total." Then the two of them both put on the headbands and turned around to challenge a new thrilling ride. Jim Dan clearly looked like he was really enjoying it, but by comparison, Player Zhou looked like he had completely gone offline. During the break, when Player Zhou thought back to just now, the more he thought about it, the more frustrated he felt. What a loss of face. It was way scarier than he'd imagined. Strange, what's supposed to be fun about this? Is everyone's taste really this hardcore? He had originally thought that Jim Dan would definitely be scared. But in the end, Jim Dan dared to go on everything. At least, Jim Dan really did look very happy. That was enough. But as soon as he thought of how Jim Dan had never smiled like that in front of him, Player Zhou felt even more annoyed. At this moment, he heard someone next to him shouting loudly, "Come and take a look! Now it's time for the Mighty Hammer King surprise event. Give it a hard smash, and take home the prize that matches your score." Player Zhou's eyes lit up instantly. Finally, something he was good at. After a while, Jim Dan came running back in a hurry. There were too many people in line over by Player Zhou's side, so it took a bit longer. "I'm sorry." But as soon as he looked up, he realized the Player Zhou who had been sitting here was gone. And over there, Player Zhou was standing in front of the hammer game, swinging the mallet up and slamming it down hard. The next second, he directly took first place in the entire venue. He casually picked up that huge teddy bear and walked off with it. He turned and walked over, handed the bear to Jim Dan. Jim Dan was a bit dazed, but still caught it. When the two of them sat down to rest, Jim Dan quietly asked Player Zhou, "We've gone on so many rides, you must be tired, right? We've been playing longer than we thought. Should we head back?" Player Zhou just looked puzzled, because Coach Nam UK had originally only planned the break to last until dinner tonight. It felt like everyone was waiting for them. There was more training in the evening, and they were the only ones having this much fun. Jim Dan also felt a bit guilty. Player Zhou, however, was completely unconcerned. "Forget about them, they'll rest on their own. Let's stay a bit longer. After we finish eating, we'll go on that one." At that moment, Player Zhou noticed that the ice cream in Jim Dan's hand had melted. Player Zhou grabbed Jim Dan's wrist directly. "It's dripping everywhere. What a waste." Before the words had even faded, he leaned in and directly licked off the ice cream that had dripped down. Watching this, Jim Dan froze on the spot, and Player Zhou also realized that Jim Dan was staring blankly at him. Player Zhou was stunned as well. The next second, his face flushed bright red. "What are you looking at? You're the one who got it all over the place." Only then did Jim Dan snap out of it and hurriedly reach for some napkins. After they finished eating, the two of them went to ride the Ferris wheel. Because the cabin was swaying a bit, Jim Dan still couldn't help worrying about Player Zhou. He asked how he was feeling now. "We just wanted you to relax today. That's why we decided to take a break. Player Zhou slowly stood up and told Jim Dan that he really did feel less tense now. On closer thought, not to mention being nervous, he was actually so relaxed that it felt a bit wrong. Before a match, he had never been like this. Is this because of Jim Dan? He was very happy, so happy that he forgot all his nervousness. But what would Jim Dan think? At this moment, the Ferris wheel suddenly made a loud clang in midair. Both of them were stunned for a moment. Is it stopping? Player Zhou actually, unexpectedly, apologized to Jim Dan. It looked like he had really figured things out this time. Just as the Ferris wheel car carrying Jim Dan and Player Zhou rose into the air, it suddenly made a loud crash. The Ferris wheel stopped, and the staff announced over the speakers that there was a technical malfunction, telling everyone to sit still and wait patiently. Seeing this, Player Zhou looked completely speechless. There are still people up here, and it suddenly breaks down? What kind of joke is this? The next second, the Ferris wheel actually started to sway. Player Zhou was so scared on the spot that he jumped. Xiaoxi and Jim Dan were also a bit flustered, but the two of them still immediately steadied their voices to comfort him. Sit down first. As long as you sit still, it won't shake. Player Zhou was trembling all over with fright. It was the first time he had ever encountered this kind of sudden situation. Jim Dan took out his phone for a look and found there was no signal. Strange. Was it because they were too high up? It seemed they could only wait for it to be repaired. Silence continued as the two of them just sat there, their gazes colliding, neither one looking away first. Player Zhou only felt the atmosphere tighten with awkwardness. After all, he had never before been alone with Jim Dan like this, and he could tell that Jim Dan was just as embarrassed. Zhou just made a few symbolic complaints. Then, the air fell quiet again all of a sudden. In order not to let the silence drag on, Zhou braced himself to find a topic and asked Jim Dan how he had been doing recently, whether everything was okay. Hearing Jim Dan say that things were okay, Zhou was speechless on the spot. What is this? Do you still feel uncomfortable staying in Seoul with me? Jim Dan sighed no. To be honest, when he had just moved back to Seoul from the countryside, he really was a bit unaccustomed to it. But now he sleeps very well, and he hasn't been drinking, and those depressive thoughts have become much fewer. He also goes to see his grandma regularly every weekend, so he's not too worried. Working at the training center also makes him very happy. Most importantly, I once again realized that I'm working together with a truly, truly remarkable athlete. I'm really grateful to you. You've thought things through for me in many ways, and the help you've given me is more than I can ever repay, especially materially. I'll remember it for the rest of my life. During the remaining period of the contract, I'll do my best to assist you. You must also get back on your feet as soon as possible and take the championship title back. Hearing Jim Dan mention the remaining period of the contract, Zhou suddenly felt a heavy drop in his chest, an indescribable pain. He clearly wanted to be a bit more stubborn, even wanted to forcefully keep Jim Dan by his side. But when he thought of the things he had done to Jim Dan before, he simply couldn't bring himself to ask him to stay. After hesitating for a moment, Zhou still spoke. I have to become a champion as soon as possible. That way, you'll also be able to go look for a better job. At that moment, he remembered what the curator said back then. If you keep letting your bad temper push you forward to crash into things. In order not to let the conversation just end there, Player Zhou still decided to say what was on his mind. Like, every time before a match I feel really helpless, and I always become especially sensitive. Especially that match against Baek Junmyeong. It made me feel even more like a taut string. At that time, I was the one who was wrong. I didn't look into things first and just snapped at you. You were only dragged into it. Hearing Player Zhou say that, I then told him it was okay, that I could completely understand. Players get sensitive before matches, and I really was at fault too. At least now we can clear up the misunderstanding, and that's really great. After saying all this, Jim Dan also felt very embarrassed and immediately turned his head to look out the window. The lights at night were really beautiful. But even after saying all that, Player Zhou still felt it wasn't enough. He remembered the birthday gift that Jim Dan had given him before, yet his attitude back then had been so terrible. He hesitated for a long time, then finally spoke again. About throwing away the gift you gave me. I'm sorry. I'd never given anyone a present before, and I'd never received that kind of gift either. So I honestly had no idea it would hurt you that much. Even if saying it only now is already too late. I'm sorry. He suddenly felt that he might finally understand how Jim Dan had been feeling. That feeling of no matter how hard you try, your feelings still can't reach the other person. Player Zhou added another line. I just wanted to apologize to you. I only wanted to apologize. You don't have to accept it. Suddenly hearing Player Zhou say that, Jim Dan suddenly didn't know how to respond. Just as Player Zhou was about to continue speaking, a sudden loud boom of fireworks exploding came from outside. The two of them turned their heads almost at the same time and looked toward the window. The scene was truly spectacular. In this kind of atmosphere, Player Zhou's heart was pounding chaotically. His gaze slowly shifted away from the fireworks and landed on Jim Dan. Then, it was as if he softly said something. Jim Dan froze for a moment and asked him what he had just said. But Player Zhou immediately turned his face away and only said it was nothing. After that, the two of them just sat there in the Ferris wheel car and quietly watched the fireworks until the end. From the speakers came the voice of a staff member, saying that the Ferris wheel had been repaired and that they would be able to leave the cabin soon, asking everyone to wait a little longer. When he went back home and showered with Player Zhou, the Ferris wheel incident was still turning over in Jim Dan's mind. When he came out after showering, he found that the bear had been placed on the sofa. Jim Dan walked over, sat down next to it, and stared at it for quite a while. Then he raised his hand and gently pinched it. In the room, Player Zhou buried his face under the pillow. In his mind, he replayed over and over the sentence he had said to Jim Dan on the Ferris wheel. The next second, his face instantly flushed burning red. He raised his hand and started frantically punching the pillow. This whole series of abnormal behavior from Player Zhou recently had directly left Jim Dan completely baffled. On the day before the comeback match, Jim Dan changed his clothes and got ready to head out. He thought back on the things that had happened over the past few days. Player Zhou buying him clothes and teaching him to swim. He had even won back that little teddy bear for him. What was even more unbelievable was that Zhou had actually apologized to him on the Ferris wheel. Thinking of this, Jim Dan felt more and more that Player Zhou really wasn't the same as before. He treated him even better than he used to, and he had never lost his temper with him again. But Jim Dan still couldn't see through what Player Zhou was thinking. Yet what he understood the least right now was, why would Player Zhou suddenly apologize to me? He clearly isn't the kind of person who would do that. I really can't figure out what he actually wants me to do. But now isn't the time to be thinking about this either. Let's hurry up and go, hurry up and go. He laughed. Speaking of which, today is the day before the match, so I should be playing games with Player Zhou today. Over here, the media were filming pre-match material for the two players. Jim Dan stood quietly at the side, keeping him company. Speaking of gaming, ever since they came back to Seoul, he hadn't played even once with Player Zhou. They clearly used to play around every few days, so why did it suddenly change recently? Could it be that he's holding himself back? At that thought, even Jim Dan wanted to laugh. How could that be possible? He was probably just too busy and simply not in the mood to play games. Anyway, this was normally Player Zhou's fixed mealtime, but Jim Dan was spacing out. Suddenly hearing the coach call his name, Jim Dan jerked back to his senses. The coach asked if he wasn't going to eat, since he hadn't taken a single bite and they were almost finished. Jim Dan said it was fine, that he just had a bit of indigestion. The coach asked worriedly if he needed some digestive medicine. Every time you go abroad, you only eat a little. It really makes people worry. Jim Dan hurriedly said it was fine, that it wasn't that serious. The coach then asked if he was nervous. After all, it had been a long time since he'd followed a competition schedule, so it was indeed possible. Potato, listening at the side, got very fired up. "Ho you, I'm really super nervous. This is a comeback match after several months. If it were me, my heart would be jumping out of my mouth. Brother Jing, you're really amazing." Player Zhou listened with a speechless look on his face. "Don't be so dramatic." They kept on chatting. Player Zhou picked up his phone and, head lowered, sent a message. At that moment, Jim Dan's phone suddenly rang. Jim Dan picked it up and saw that it was from Player Zhou, telling him to come to his room at 11 o'clock later. Jim Dan's heart sank, and that familiar feeling came back again. When they were almost done eating, the coach reminded everyone, "There's a match tomorrow at noon, so go rest early. Gather at 7 a.m. in front of the hotel counter. Jing also needs to sleep early today, understand?" Player Zhou responded that he knew. After speaking, Player Zhou stood up, as if he were going back to his room first. Jim Dan's gaze followed him, watching Player Zhou's back. Jim Dan let out a soft sigh. Afterwards, Jim Dan went to the door at the time he'd been told, raised his hand, and knocked. "Player Zhou, it's Jim Dan." The next second, the door was yanked open, and Jim Dan was startled on the spot. Immediately after, he was pulled into the room by Player Zhou. With that one sentence of encouragement from Jim Dan, Player Zhou really did seem like he'd been ignited, his power maxed out, and he quickly won that match. The next day, Jim Dan groggily opened his eyes. He saw that Player Zhou beside him was already awake. Jim Dan lowered his voice to remind him, "It's time to go." At that moment, Player Zhou leaned toward Jim Dan and said quietly, "The match is starting soon. Give me a bit of strength." cheer me on. So Jim Dan reached out his hand and made a cheering gesture for him, but player Zhou directly grabbed his hand in a firm grip. Jim Dan's heartbeat suddenly went out of rhythm, and he was startled again. After a moment, player Zhou finally let him go. That's enough. I'll head out first. At the competition venue, with the host's introduction, the showdown between player Gabriel and player Zhou officially began. First, Gabriel politely bowed to player Zhou, and as soon as the audience saw it, they thought, this guy's quite the gentleman. Player Zhou watched his whole routine, his expression full of speechlessness. What is this guy playing at? Just then, Gabriel raised his head and gave him a smile. The next second, he suddenly swung a punch at player Zhou. Right after that, he fired off several more punches in quick succession. The offensive was fierce and fast, and for a moment player Zhou could only be forced onto the defensive. Player Zhou seized an opening and immediately counterattacked. But every time, Gabriel easily dodged. The next second, Gabriel once again closed in to attack. At the same time, the host's commentary completely ignited the whole arena, as wave after wave of fierce attacks crashed down. Player Zhou still ended up getting hit by Gabriel. And just like that, the first round ended with player Gabriel's victory. Gabriel stepped forward, patted player Zhou on the shoulder. You still look really heavy on your feet, why don't you take a longer rest? The Emperor. It seems it's time for him to step down too. Being provoked like that, player Zhou was of course furious. The second round began immediately. Gabriel once again opened up the distance from player Zhou, not giving player Zhou any chance to strike at close range. He was still using that same vicious combo, and this time after player Zhou tanked the attacks head-on. With a beautiful spin, he suddenly whipped out a back kick. Before Gabriel could even react, player Zhou had already closed in with quick steps. Right after that, an uppercut was sent straight up. In an instant, Gabriel was knocked to the ground, and even the announcer was stunned. The Emperor is back. Player Zhou Zhejiang is incredible. Player Zhou turned around with a proud look. With those soft, flimsy punches, you dare to act so cocky? At this moment, the whole arena erupted in the loudest cheers. Player Zhou Zhejiang delivered a flawless performance that showed no trace of any hiatus, and smoothly took the victory in his comeback match. Over at the sanatorium, after watching this match, the director was also so excited that he burst into loud laughter. That kid has been best at throwing uppercuts since he was little. The coaches at the venue were moved to tears. I knew it. Zhu Zhejiang is going to give Baek Junmyeong a fatal blow with this. In the audience, Jim Dan finally let out a sigh of relief. At this moment, player Zhu turned around and looked straight at Jim Dan. Did I do well? He suddenly asked this. I was stunned by the question for a moment, then immediately started nodding and clapping. Very good. Really very good. Extremely good. Extremely good. At this moment, the host came over to interview contestant Zhou, first congratulating him on winning the championship, then asking him, did he have anything he wanted to say to contestant Baek Junmyeong? The next second, contestant Zhou directly snatched the microphone away. Facing the camera, he shouted across the air at Baek Junmyeong. His wording was not polite at all. He was smiling very lightly, but that smile was full of contempt and provocation. When he finished that acceptance speech, laced with swear words, the host panicked on the spot. This was a live broadcast, so he could only hurry to forcibly change the subject. In short, contestant Zhu Zhejiang had officially declared war on contestant Baek Junmyeong, and Baek Junmyeong ought to be nervous now. After coming off stage, even the coach broke into a cold sweat for him and reminded him that this was a live broadcast. How could he curse in public? Contestant Zhou, however, didn't care. So what? He should be grateful I only said that much. After watching that match on TV and then hearing contestant Zhou's provocative words, Baek Junmyeong was so furious that he grabbed an ashtray and smashed the TV. This lunatic Zhu Zhejiang actually dares to challenge me. He bared his teeth. He was nothing more than a little errand boy who used to run around the neighborhood for me, yet he dared to be this insolent. Seeing that he was about to smash something else, the manager immediately rushed over to stop him and reminded him that the TV was very expensive. Anyway, you were going to fight Zhu Zhejiang for the championship again, so you just need to get ready to win. Baek Junmyeong abruptly slapped the representative's hand away. Enough, I know that too. It doesn't matter what method you use, as long as you use every possible means to secure victory. Just wait and see, the one who'll be laughing in the end will definitely be me. How dare he step on my head? How dare he step on my head? Player Zhou just warned Hyuzong last time. Who knew that this time, his and Jim Dan's little escapade would get busted by Hyuzong again. Heh. A few weeks after the match with player Gabriel ended, the group of players who had gone over to Baek Junmyeong's side suddenly came back to look for player Zhou and the coach. We're really sorry. Could you take us in one more time? The coach was shaking with rage. Right after you lost to Jaegyong, You all ran off to Baek Junmyeong's gym. And now you say you want to come back? That's way too shameless. You tell me yourselves. Several of them lowered their heads, faces full of shame. We know we were wrong. Back then they said they'd train us and let us make a lot of money. But forget proper training. Even the atmosphere there was atrocious. Even if Jaegyeongbro scolds us, it's only right if we can actually learn something. We really regretted leaving. We were thinking way too simply. We know it's really shameless of us, but could you take us back? The coach looked at them in this state and got a headache. He turned to Player Zhou and said, Zai-jing, you're the director. You decide. Player Zhou's face was so filled with suppressed anger that it felt icy. The few of them were scared by him and all thought to themselves, there's definitely no chance now. At this moment, Player Zhou first glanced at Jim Dan beside him, then said to them, do as you like. As soon as he said this, everyone on the spot was stunned. The contestants burst into tears of joy on the spot. However, Player Zhou also immediately laid out conditions for them. First, a 20-kilometer jog, then 800 sit-ups, 800 burpees, 800 push-ups, and 2 hours of jump rope. Only after finishing these every day are you allowed to come to the gym. If you can't even do that, you're out immediately, understood? Contestants, answer at once. Just as he was about to leave, the coach caught up and asked Player Zhou, are you feeling unwell? How come you're suddenly so kind? So it turns out he's learned to be sensible now. Player Zhou couldn't even be bothered to respond and only felt that he was unbearably noisy. That scene just now had also left Jim Dan completely baffled. That night, after everyone at the gym had left, Player Zhou told Jim Dan to stop mopping the floor, go change clothes, and come with him. Jim Dan was still thinking to himself, are we going to play games together again today? But once in the car, Player Zhou said, starting tomorrow, train sports with me. Jim Dan was shocked on the spot. What? Sports? Player Zhou looked at him, his tone very calm. Yes, your physical strength is too poor. Build up your basic fitness first. Then your work ability will improve along with it. Jim Dan originally wanted to find an excuse to refuse, but Player Zhou didn't give him any way out at all. I'm telling you to learn, so you learn. Jim Dan could only grit his teeth and agree. After that, every day when Player Zhou finished his own training, he would always stay behind to teach Jim Dan how to work out. Besides basic training, he would also have him practice boxing. Slowly, Jim Dan's fighting started to look somewhat decent too. But before long, he started panting again, his chest tightening. It was a bit better than before, but Jim Dan knew there was still a long way to go. At first, he would get so exhausted just from skipping rope that he couldn't even get up. Only when he had that comparison did Jim Dan realize his stamina really was improving. But I'm still a bit worried. I asked Player Zhou, after training you're supposed to rest, yet you still stay behind to teach me. Is that really okay? Player Zhou looked at me and asked, are you worried I don't have enough stamina? I'm fine. Jim Dan thanked him earnestly. But thanks to you, I've improved a lot. Even if one day I'm the only one left, I'll keep working out. As soon as he said that, Player Zhou's expression clearly darkened a little. He thought of the championship match with Baek Junmyeong. The date had already been set. That would be the last bout they had agreed on, and the time he and Jim Dan could spend together was already running out. So during this period, he had to seize every moment and do everything he could for Jim Dan. He reminded Jim Dan again to take good care of his body from now on and not push himself into overwork. Jim Dan nodded and said he would. Player Zhou reached out his hand and hooked pinkies with him. Then make a promise with me. Suddenly they were hooking pinkies like children, and both of their faces instantly turned red. Jim Dan immediately averted his gaze and, forcing himself, changed the subject. So, is today's workout all finished? Player Zhou looked at him and said lightly, not yet. Next he was going to teach Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Use a defensive posture to sweep from the bottom position. As long as you flip me over and then climb on top of me, that's enough. You've learned this before, right? Jim Dan tried once just as he was told and immediately felt it was unbelievably hard. Never mind flipping him, he couldn't even make Player Zhou budge an inch. You're way more muscular than I am. Player Zhou was amused by the way he looked and shot back. That's the best you can do? Then he began to attack Player Zhou in return. Whenever you say something that weak, you're immediately countered. Jim Dan almost surrendered in an instant. In a sport like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, even if there's a big size difference, you can still use technique to turn things around. In other words, you also have a way to pin down someone with a build like mine. Being pinned underneath the whole time, don't you find that infuriating? Come on. Give it a try. So Jim Dan did as Player Zhou said and slowly tried again. He really pinned Player Zhou down. Jim Dan was overjoyed. He'd done it. Player Zhou was happy for him too. Well done. I told you, you actually have a strong will to win. But before long, Jim Dan ran out of strength too. The next second, Player Ju suddenly pulled him into his arms and asked what technique he was using this time. Player Ju immediately corrected him. This isn't technique. Don't let your guard down or else your spot will get snatched away like this. As he spoke, he leaned in and gave him a kiss. Jim Dan panicked at once and quietly reminded him that they were in the gym. But Player Ju didn't care at all. It's not like it's the first time, and no one's going to come. At that moment, outside, Hyuzong and Potato were walking this way. Hyuzong even told him to help hold the focus mitts later. As soon as the door opened, Hyuzong froze on the spot. The two people inside were also startled. The next second, Hyuzong abruptly slammed the door shut. Potato, standing next to him, was completely confused. Right after that, Player Ju came out from inside, panting, let out a cold laugh. Huh, Cho Hyuzong. Can we talk? Player Ju was treating Jim Dan better and better. Not only did he take him to get a custom suit made, he also took him to eat at a high-end restaurant. Jim Dan followed Player Ju up to the rooftop. Hyuzong looked at him and snapped. You're really going to play games even in the gym? Player Ju told him to shut up on the spot and coldly demanded. Why did you come here at this hour to throw a fit? Hyuzong was even more annoyed. Coming to the gym after my schedule is over is a crime now? Your coach clearly said I could come. But Player Zhou doesn't care at all. I'm the head coach here. Without my permission, who allowed you to come in on your own? Hyuzong shoots back at him. Was that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu just now? Who does Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu by going in for a kiss? Hyuzong twists the knife a bit more. The therapist is just too kind. How could he do that kind of thing with you again? Player Zhou is furious. None of your damn business. Just try running your mouth around. I'll kill you. Hyuzong answers him right away. As if I would. You think I'm crazy? For the therapist's sake, I would never tell. Then he presses on, you two, you're not dating, right? When Player Zhou hears this, he freezes. What? A scene flashes through his mind. The time he was having fun with Jim Dan at the amusement park. He immediately tries to dodge the topic and says stiffly, me and him were not in that kind of relationship. Hyuzong finds that reasonable. You've already done that kind of thing to him. How could you possibly be dating? The therapist isn't an idiot. How could he be with scum like you? The lowest of the low. The next second, Player Zhou suddenly yanks him by the collar. Still not shutting up? Believe it or not, I'll tear your mouth apart. Hyuzong shakes him off at once. Look at you. Losing your temper and throwing hands right away. Fix this crappy habit first. I won't tell anyone what I saw today. Treat the therapist a bit better. But I still can't bring myself to support you too. The therapist is really too good for this. You piece of trash. He shoots him a hand gesture. Player Zhou is just as blunt and flips him one right back. After Hyuzong leaves, Player Zhou just stands there in a daze. Just now, that sentence from Hyuzong kept echoing in his ears. He clenched his fists. He had done that kind of thing to Hyuzong. That day at the gym when they met for the first time at the Candy Language Center. Jim Dan said that Player Zhou had just been teaching him Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and Potato was watching on with envy, saying he wanted to join next time too. But as Hyuzong listened to all of this, knowing everything, he grew angrier the more he heard. Since schedules had to be booked in advance. On this day, Jim Dan and Player Zhou came to the nursing home, and were about to head back after visiting Grandma. Suddenly, snow began to fall from the sky. It seemed that winter had really set in. At this moment, Player Zhou called out to Jim Dan and said they should go somewhere before heading home. Then he led Jim Dan into a high-end clothing store. As soon as the staff in the store saw Player Zhou, they immediately came up to him enthusiastically. The store manager walked over and said to Player Zhou that the new season's collection was already on the shelves, and asked if they should bring it out for him to see. Player Zhou said there was no need. Today he wasn't picking something for himself, but choosing a suit for him. Jim Dan was startled on the spot. What, me? Why? Once I'm done with my work here, you'll be going to interview for a new job, right? You should wear something a bit more formal for an interview. But among the clothes I gave you before, there wasn't a suit. After hearing this, Jim Dan fell silent for a few seconds. He then told Player Zhou it was fine, that he could just buy a suit later. But Player Zhou still insisted, so Jim Dan could only nod and agree. After that, Player Zhou just sat off to the side and waited, looking at Jim Dan, who had finished changing, walking out. The clerk said to him, compared to dark colors, we first let the customer try a more composed tone. We also help the customer tidy his hair. How does it feel? Is the customer satisfied? Jim Dan felt a bit awkward, took a look in the mirror, and muttered softly. It seems not bad. The clerk next to him instantly maxed out the emotional value. It really suits you so well, you look just like a groom. Player Zhou was so shaken he couldn't stay calm, and decided on the spot. This set. Jim Dan was a bit at a loss. It really suits me, but I still feel kind of not used to it. Player Zhou pressed down his emotions and told him seriously. It suits you very well. Just wear it like this. After buying the clothes, Player Zhou took Jim Dan to a restaurant. Jim Dan looked around, unable to hold back a sigh. This place is way too luxurious. Player Zhou asked him, "Is this your first time in a place like this?" Jim Dan said that before, Huzong had also taken him to somewhere similar. Player Zhou's expression changed instantly. "What did you say?" In his heart, he practically wanted to beat Huzong to death. Seeing something was wrong, Jim Dan immediately added, "But this place is more high-end." Only then did Player Zhou reply in a cold voice, "Of course." The snow outside the window was still falling non-stop. Jim Dan asked Player Zhou, "Will it be okay to drive later? If too much snow piles up, it'll be very dangerous." Player Zhou said, "As long as it's not a blizzard, it's fine." There wasn't much time left before the championship match. Listening to that, Jim Dan also felt a bit emotional. "We've been working together for quite a while now. Feels like time just flew by all of a sudden." At this moment, the waiter started bringing the dishes one after another. The waiter asked, "Would you like some wine? We've just introduced a new red wine that goes very well with winter dishes." Zhou turned to ask Jim Dan if he wanted a drink. Jim Dan hesitated. "I probably shouldn't." Zhou pressed, "Haven't you basically stopped drinking lately? Just go along with the mood today." The doctor also said a little is fine, and I'll call a designated driver. Since that was the case, Jim Dan ordered a glass. After that, the two of them ate and chatted, and the atmosphere gradually warmed up. Jim Dan was smiling very happily. With one glance, Zhou could tell that he was drunk. He kept teasing Zhou about that boxing practice incident, and Jim Dan couldn't help stopping him. "Knock it off, you're obviously younger than me. Why do you keep teasing me? Otherwise, do you want me to treat you like an older brother? But your face and everything you do are completely like a kid, though you really are older than me." Seeing that Jim Dan was still being stubborn, Zhou simply said, "All right, eat more." With a blissful look on his face, Jim Dan's tone even softened. "This is really so good. I want to eat this kind of thing every day." Seeing something at the corner of his mouth, Zhou leaned in a little and wiped it off for him with his hand. "Are you planning to pack this up and take it home to eat? Acting like this, and you still say you're older than me." Looking at Jim Dan like this, Zhou suddenly felt a weight in his heart. What a pity. Only now is he finally smiling this happily. After that, the two of them talked about many more things. Suddenly, Zhou sensed a gaze from the side. A man over there was actually staring at them the whole time, and that look in his eyes was so disgusting it made people angry. The man's gaze fell on Jim Dan. Player Zhou suddenly remembered back when Jim Dan worked under him. It was only at this moment that Player Zhou finally understood. So everything he had done before had been hurting Jim Dan all along. While they were eating, the man next to them was still staring fixedly over here. The way he stared made Player Zhou feel uncomfortable all over. Jim Dan followed Player Zhou's line of sight, and in the next second, Jim Dan was directly startled. The wine glass in his hand slipped and fell. Player Zhou immediately steadied him and quietly asked if he was okay, but Jim Dan froze on the spot, then snapped back to himself and hurriedly apologized. This behavior of the man's instantly drew his companion's displeasure as well. Riangmulguan * stood up on the spot and walked off just like that. Player Zhou quietly asked Jim Dan, "Are you feeling unwell somewhere?" Jim Dan's stomach lurched violently, and a wave of nausea surged up. But in his mind, images from that time flashed back beyond his control. His body was trembling, yet he still forced himself to say to Player Zhou, "I'm fine." He stood up, wanting to go to the restroom. Player Zhou frowned, unable to figure out why he suddenly became like this. Should he follow him? At this moment, that man stepped forward and directly asked Player Zhou, "Are you Jim Dan's lover?" Player Zhou was completely baffled. The man tapped the table and said in a certain tone, "Right? Jim Dan's really lucky to be smiling so happily and even able to eat such an expensive meal." Player Zhou listened and felt even more upset, and coldly retorted, "Who are you? Do you know Jim Dan?" The man showed a wicked grin. "Of course I do. I could never forget him. How does he feel? I was actually thinking of trying him out first. But he's really not easy to handle. Looks like this time he's hooked a big sponsor." The next second, Player Zhou charged forward in anger and grabbed him by the collar. "You bastard! What did you just say?" The man wasn't flustered at all. Instead, he provoked him. "Why so worked up? How much did you pay him? How many bills does it take for him to be willing to be with you? He's that poor. He must really love money, right?" Player Zhou was so angry that his hands were shaking, almost about to hit him, and he roared directly, "Shut up!" The commotion instantly drew everyone's eyes over. When Jim Dan came back and saw what was happening over there, he froze on the spot. The man acted like he wasn't afraid of dying, his voice vicious. "That guy ruined my life and forced me to live groveling to everyone. And now he's living it up like this. How could I possibly not feel wronged? Going to hell? Then let's go together. Hearing him get more and more outrageous, Player Zhou completely lost his patience. He raised his fist, about to bring it down, when Jim Dan rushed over and grabbed Player Zhou from behind in a tight hug. No, Player Zhou, I'm begging you. Don't hit him, the match is coming up soon. What if you get held criminally responsible? You absolutely can't miss the match, please. Just endure it. Player Zhou clenched his teeth in fury, and in the next second, he violently flung the man away. The man was scared out of his wits on the spot and turned around to run. After that, the two of them went back home. Zhou the player stared at Jim Dan, explained clearly. What on earth is going on? In a low voice, Jim Dan said that the man was the director of the hospital at his previous job. Zhou the player was full of question marks as he listened. The hospital director? What did you say? Jim Dan hesitated for quite a while. Exine Luoan hadn't told Zhou the player because he had finally managed to get into a major hospital, Exine Luoan General Hospital, and he wanted to just work there steadily. At first, he even thought the director was a good person, but after some time, he suddenly started to touch me inappropriately, and then became more and more excessive. I didn't let him succeed, but the hospital still fired me, a low-level employee. Just like that. Later, I don't know how, but strange rumors started spreading, and no hospital was willing to hire me. In the end, I came here to be your exclusive physical therapist. That kind of thing happened to you? Then why did you tell me something else at the beginning? Jim Dan told him he had lied to him because he was afraid that if he said he had no experience, he would be kicked out. At that time, he was really short of money. I'm sorry, I lied to you. Player Zhou suddenly got worked up. What are you apologizing for? Suddenly, a scene flashed through his mind. Back to the first time he played a game with Jim Dan, the things he himself had done to Jim Dan. He then pressed on. Why didn't you tell me that something like that had happened before? Jim Dan was silent for a moment, then said softly, what's the use of saying it? Anyway, to you, the competition is what matters most. Player Zhou, don't worry. What happened between us was all consensual, and it was me who brought up the money. And no matter what I went through before, it has nothing to do with Player Zhou. And it isn't something you should carry. Player Zhou immediately told him not to say that. He asked, have you been enduring it all this time? How can you stand it? Jim Dan told him, it really was quite hard at first, but later it stopped mattering. Cause back then I really liked you. When Player Zhou heard this, he froze on the spot. Another scene flashed through his mind, when Jim Dan was giving him a gift, and then there was that letter. What he had originally wanted to say to himself in the end was, at this thought, Player Zhou's heart suddenly sank. It was a mistake from the very beginning. I never should have met Jim Dan. Everything I did to him was just pain. That day on the Ferris wheel, I even lowered my voice and told him, when the competition is over, don't leave, but he didn't hear it. Thinking about it now, what right did I have to keep him? I never had that right at all. Seeing Player Zhou looking so guilty, Jim Dan felt awful inside as well. At night, Player Zhou couldn't sleep and sat alone by the television. He kept replaying that scene in the restaurant. The more he thought about it, the more annoyed he became, the more agitated he felt. He picked up his phone and came across that news. That doctor had his medical license revoked. The more Player Zhou read, the angrier he got, wishing he could beat the hell out of him. But after going through something like that, Jim Dan still said that he had once liked me. I had originally thought that as long as I brought Jim Dan back here, I would definitely be able to solve the problem. If Jim Dan could recover his health and live on his own, that would also count as a good thing for me. But it seems I've started to have different expectations. The next day, at the National Training Center gym, all the athletes were training desperately. Jim Dan sat to the side, his mind still stuck on last night's scene. He couldn't understand how that doctor still had the nerve to show up in front of him, nor could he figure out what exactly he had said to make Player Zhou that angry. Just as Jim Dan was lost in thought, a sudden loud crash came from beside him. So it turns out the sandbag had been blasted apart by Player Zhou again. But even so, Player Zhou still kept pounding that sandbag, one punch after another. When the other players saw something was wrong, they hurriedly rushed over to stop him. And Jingji, stop hitting it, you'll get hurt. After that, Player Zhou took Jim Dan to the hospital for a follow-up checkup. This time, when the examination was over, the doctor told Jim Dan the results were pretty good. Today they would switch him to a weaker medication, but the condition still had to be monitored. The dosage needed to be reduced gradually and only then stopped in the end. Starting from now, sleeping alone shouldn't be a problem anymore. That night when they got home, Jim Dan still slept in the room Player Zhou had prepared for him, just like before. But now, he actually felt a bit unaccustomed to it. He turned his head and looked to the side. When Player Zhou used to be there, he would urge him to go to sleep quickly. But now, the space beside him was empty. Ever since that day, Player Zhou had always seemed to be in a bad mood. Is he really okay? Compared to himself, it was player Zhou who needed a peaceful night's sleep even more. In the middle of the night, after Jim Dan had fallen asleep, player Zhou staggered into his room. Then he sat down by his bed. He gazed gently at the sleeping Jim Dan. He reached out his hand, as if wanting to touch him, but in the next second he suddenly pulled his hand back. In a low voice, he asked Jim Dan if he was okay, but his body had begun to tremble. Hearing the movement, Jim Dan slowly opened his eyes and looked at him in confusion. What is going on? Player Zhou asked him. Knowing you clearly have that kind of psychological trauma, how could I still make that kind of suggestion to you? In that instant, he felt no different from that kind of person, and his anger surged straight up. Seeing him like this, Jim Dan immediately stepped forward, anxious to calm him down, reaching out to ask if he was okay. I really am fine. But player Zhou didn't believe it at all. You say you're fine every time, but not once has it really been fine. He put it very bluntly. It's absolutely terrible. I'm being crushed by guilt and can't even breathe, and I have no idea what to do. Seeing him like this, Jim Dan's heart ached along with him. He earnestly told player Zhou, you're not that kind of person, I really am fine. During this period of working and living together with you, there have also been many happy days. And when I play games with you, it's not like I reject it every single time. So don't feel so guilty. Player Zhou listened with a look of shock, and the next second he stepped forward and gave him a light kiss. But player Zhou still didn't understand what exactly he felt for Jim Dan. When Jim Dan asked him like that, he actually couldn't answer for a moment. The next day, Jim Dan blinked awake in a daze, turned his head, and saw player Zhou behind him, got startled on the spot, and his mind instantly replayed yesterday. Thinking of yesterday, Jim Dan slowly tried to sit up, but was suddenly pulled tightly into player Zhou's arms, while he murmured in a low voice, don't leave. Seeing how deeply he was asleep, he was probably sleep-talking. But Jim Dan still held his breath and quietly pulled his arms and legs free. He went into the bathroom to take a shower, and the more he washed, the clearer his head became. He'd actually behaved like that last night. So embarrassing. While making breakfast, Jim Dan's mind was still circling around this matter. He wondered if, last night, he had been completely swept away by the mood. Otherwise, how could he have done something like that? But when he saw player Zhou like that, he couldn't help softening. It was as if he had only recently realized how comfortable it was to be with player Zhou. Not just warm, but giving him a very solid sense of security. So good it was almost scary. Once the championship match ended, all of this would end as well. Jim Dan suddenly came back to his senses and almost forgot. No matter how wonderful it was, this was still just work. The biggest goal was to make player Zhou win. The reason he was here at all was to help player Zhou break his superstition for the comeback match. Player Zhou's gentleness was because he felt guilty toward him. He shouldn't treat every one of Zhou's actions as meaningful. The more Jim Dan thought, the more distracted he became. By the time Jim Dan came back to himself, he realized the food in the pan was already burnt. A sheet of char. Jim Dan flustered, hurriedly grabbed the pan off the stove. Suddenly, an anxious voice from player Zhou sounded behind him. When did you get up? Why did you come out here without a word again and not say anything at all? Didn't I tell you, if you get up earlier than me, you should wake me? Jim Dan immediately apologized, saying that now that they were sleeping separately, he thought it wouldn't matter if he got up first. Player Zhou sighed and told Jim Dan to forget it. There was no need to apologize. He stepped forward, sniffed with a frown. What's with this smell? Did something get burned? Player Zhou's emotions clearly hadn't recovered from last night's distress. He looked at Jim Dan, who was quietly eating beside him. He felt even more puzzled. Doesn't Jim Dan get tired? Jim Dan said he was a bit tired, but it was fine, he'd be okay after a cup of coffee later. But when player Zhou said, you don't need to make breakfast anymore, Jim Dan still froze for a moment. Player Zhou said, don't get up early to make breakfast anymore. Sleep a bit more. And don't push yourself so hard at work in the future either. You just need to do the physical therapy you're in charge of. Jim Dan suddenly didn't know how to respond. You don't have to. This is also my job. But player Zhou was very insistent, telling Jim Dan to take good care of his body. You looked drained yesterday too. You almost collapsed from exhaustion. Then he lowered his voice and said a quiet thank you to Jim Dan. But he still added, there's really no need for you to do this anymore from now on. Player Zhou gave a small laugh. You say that every time. Do you feel a lot of pressure? Then try to get used to it. Before Jim Dan let him finish, he cut him off the very next second. Let's stop here. Really, please just stop here. I've already stopped expecting anything. I know that you only take care of me like this because you feel guilty toward me, but you've seen it too. I'm really doing very well now. You don't have to keep doing this. I'm fine. Player Zhou froze on the spot for an instant. So you think the reason I do all this is just because of guilt? Jim Dan frowned. Isn't it? What else could it be? Being asked this by Jim Dan, player Zhou actually couldn't answer for a moment. At this moment, Jim Dan stood up. I'm heading out first. Take your time eating. Player Zhou sat there alone. He kept replaying what Jim Dan had just said. He couldn't say exactly what it was, but it definitely couldn't be just guilt. Yet, as soon as he thought of the mistakes he'd made in the past, felt like his throat was blocked, and he couldn't get a single word out. This feeling, what on earth is it supposed to be? On the other side, that doctor, because he owed money, was caught by Baek Junmyung's men and pinned down for a savage beating. He begged for mercy desperately while being beaten. Baek Junmyung walked closer and asked him, "Want to do something for me? As long as you get it done, all your debt will be wiped clean. But if you fail, you can forget about leaving here alive." The doctor nodded frantically, agreeing over and over. One of the underlings came over and asked, "What are you planning to have him do?" Baek Junmyung just curled his lips, his smile icy cold. So this is what it feels like to be understood. Player Zhou stared at the Jim Dan in front of him, completely stunned. That day, Jim Dan went with player Zhou to the hospital to visit grandma. As soon as the young nurse at the front desk saw them, she immediately brought out a pile of posters, wanting player Zhou's autograph. When she said the villagers had asked her to get the signatures for them, player Zhou was even more shocked. How many people actually live here? A few thousand? The young nurse was also quite helpless and could only explain. She had actually tried to persuade him long ago not to bring them anymore. But everyone waited every week for the weekly player's autograph, saying they wanted to take it back for their grandchildren. Seeing how busy he was, Jim Dan decided to go see the director first. After signing the autographs, player Zhou went straight to his grandma's hospital room. When grandma mentioned the previous matches, player Zhou was stunned. "Grandma, you watched them too?" Grandma looked at him and nodded seriously. "Of course I did. Every time I watch your matches, I feel like I'm being recharged with energy. How can you be so strong? You're really so cool." Hearing grandma praise him like that, player Zhou felt his heart clench. Then he absolutely couldn't let himself slack off. Grandma went on to say that lately it looked like a bit of flesh had grown on little Dan's face. Player Zhou told her that he had been the one always making Jim Dan eat more. After listening, grandma smiled especially happily. Whenever little Dan comes across something he cares about, he just can't eat. When he was a kid, he could clearly eat so much. Before she could finish, grandma suddenly started coughing. The moment player Zhou saw this, he panicked and immediately went to call a doctor. But grandma grabbed him. "No need. It's fine." After she caught her breath, she continued talking about how cute Jim Dan had been as a child, and even asked player Zhou, "Have you seen his childhood photos?" Player Zhou told her that he had seen one photo of the two of them together. Grandma told him to open that cabinet, saying that little Dan had already helped her tidy it up and that there were many more inside. Once the photo album was taken out, grandma and player Zhou started flipping through it together. As they looked, she told player Zhou stories about Jim Dan when he was little. In the meantime, player Zhou did not forget to take out his phone and secretly record these moments. Looking at those old photos, a slow smile appeared on grandma's face. "Me, as long as little Dan can be happy, I have no other wishes. And also, I hope you and player Jing can live happily together. You've always been this gentle." As he spoke, he raised his hand and gently stroked player Zhou's cheek. After a while, Jim Dan walked over. His eyes were red, clearly from crying, but he still forced out a smile. As soon as he appeared, grandma immediately brightened up. "My baby, why are you only here now? The weather is so nice. I want to go out for a walk with you all." Jim Dan told her he had gone to see the doctor first. Now it was too late. Dinner was about to be delivered, so they would go out together next time. So grandma decided to take a nap first. "Little Dan, come earlier next time." He sniffled. Seeing grandma like this, Jim Dan suddenly felt a sharp sting in his nose. Player Zhou beside him also noticed that brief flash of sorrow on Jim Dan's face. He remembered his earlier conversation with the doctor. Jim Dan felt his chest grow even tighter with pain. He then said to player Zhou, "We'll leave after grandma falls asleep." Jim Dan gazed at the sea outside the window. He asked player Zhou, "Can we stop here for a bit before we head off again?" So player Zhou pulled the car over. After getting out, Jim Dan walked straight toward the beach. Player Zhou got out as well and immediately sneezed from the cold. Jim Dan told him he could just wait in the car. "It's too cold. I'll only stay for 10 minutes and then come back." "Do you really want to sit alone in the car? Bored?" Saying that, player Zhou draped the blanket over Jim Dan. Jim Dan froze for a moment, then immediately lowered his voice and said thank you. The two of them just sat there quietly like that. After a while, Jim Dan spoke first. "The dusk here is beautiful, isn't it? When I used to feel awful, I often came here. So you came now as well because you're feeling awful?" "I had always thought I was already fully mentally prepared, But when the doctor actually said those words out loud, I still couldn't accept them at all. Even so, I still wanted to smile and hold it together in front of Grandma. But today, I really can't. Right now, I really am about to become someone who's completely alone. My parents died in an accident when I was very young. I can hardly even remember what they looked like. And after that, it was just Grandma and me depending on each other. The only person I could call family was Grandma. But with this sense of loss, I don't know if I can endure it. I've always been living for Grandma. If it really is just me left, can I still live well? To be honest, I don't have any confidence at all. As Jim Dan spoke, tears started falling. Only then did he snap out of it and hastily apologize. I'm sorry. I can't believe I said all that. You probably don't want to hear it, right? Player Joe said, no, that's not it. In order to comfort Jim Dan, Player Joe also decided to tell him a story. It's the story of someone I know. That person also had no parents from a young age and no siblings and grew up alone. He said he felt like he was the only one left in this world. Even if he really was being crushed by loneliness so much that he couldn't breathe, as long as he had a goal and started moving forward toward that goal, he would always find a way to keep living. Everyone is the same. Even if you feel empty and lonely because you're all by yourself. But as time goes by, you slowly forget that feeling. You should be the same. That's your story, isn't it? Suddenly being seen through by Jim Dan, Player Joe felt a bit guilty all at once. What are you talking about? Actually, Jim Dan had already heard about his story from the director. Hearing this, Player Joe was both angry and shocked, and immediately lowered his head to apologize. I'm sorry. I was the one who went to ask him. I never even dreamed that you went through something like that before. Really, couldn't tell at all. In that moment, Player Joe was so embarrassed he could hardly breathe. How could anyone possibly tell? Why should I have to say such a shameful past out loud myself? Even if people found out, they would only look down on me. Seriously. Of all things, the director just had to tell you about that. After you heard it, didn't you feel disappointed? Jim Dan was clearly taken aback. After hearing all that, you don't have any thoughts about it at all? You must think it's ridiculous that I pretend I've never lacked food or clothing since I was a kid. Right? Jim Ju told him that he was indeed a little surprised. But what I thought after hearing it was, so you really have been that strong ever since you were a child. It feels like I've never had the kind of willpower you do. For you to have been working that hard ever since you were little is really amazing. If back then you were a younger brother I was really close to, I think I would have said to you in person, you're truly incredible. On your way to where you are now, you must have run into a lot of really difficult things, right? Back then you were clearly still just a kid, and yet you managed to get through everything and make it all the way here, which shows that you're really very strong inside. Player Joe hadn't expected Jim Dan to answer like this. In that moment, for the first time, Player Joe felt, so there really is someone who understands me. Although he had spaced out a little in the middle, Player Joe still slowly saw clearly. What is the most important thing right now? After hearing what Jim Dan said, Player Joe was stunned on the spot. After a moment of silence, he said, I don't want anyone to see me like that, and I don't want anyone to pity me, because that would make me seem very weak, and it would also affect my condition for the match. Jim Dan asked him, was it exactly because of this way of thinking that you started becoming superstitious? Player Joe said it was because he needed a pre-match ritual that could help him calm down. Even if it was a terrible ritual, only like this could he feel a little more at ease inside. After he finished speaking, even Player Joe himself felt it was unbelievable that he would actually tell someone about this. And that person was Jim Dan. Listening, Jim Dan finally spoke up and shared what he thought. Could it be that, in order to become stronger, you've been constantly forcing yourself? I think your superstition is more like a kind of determination. Even though you say it's a terrible pre-match ritual, the fact that you're very strong won't change because of it. Player Joe felt that he had been comforted by him. It also felt like he finally didn't have to be so afraid of being the only one left anymore. Even though I'm not your family, but no matter where you are or what you're doing, I'll always be on your side. When Player Joe said that, Jim Dan almost burst into tears on the spot. Noticing Jim Dan's startled gaze, Player Joe hurriedly explained that what he meant was he would be cheering him on. But in that moment, Jim Dan couldn't hold it together at all, and his eyes suddenly grew hot. He just started crying outright. As soon as Player Joe saw that, he panicked. What's wrong? Did I say something wrong again? Jim Dan raised his hand and wiped away his tears. Player Joe, just hearing you say that, I'm already really grateful, really. The next day, Player Joe took Jim Dan to the gym. Looking at Jim Dan sleeping next to him, Player Joe didn't wake him up right away. He lifted his eyes and checked the time again. There was only half a month left before the match. There really weren't many days like this left, going to work together with Jim Dan. After he went upstairs, Player Joe saw those so-called experts on TV insisting that Baek Junmyeong would win this time. Just then, the coach walked over and turned off the TV on the spot. In Jaeong, don't watch that kind of program. They're just talking nonsense. Experts? Bull. Go train. But player Zhou was still so angered by those words that his chest felt tight. During training afterward, player Zhou was out of it from beginning to end. He wanted to click his way through and beat his opponent fast, to just end it in one clean blow, clenching his teeth, irritation churning in his heart. But if that happens, Jim Dan, the coach under the stage, saw that he kept defending and still hadn't counterattacked, and grew so anxious he was almost fuming. Just then, a fist came straight at fighter Zhou and knocked him to the ground on the spot. Coach Tue immediately rushed onto the stage to call a stop. The yellow-haired guy was stunned too. Injing Ge, are you okay? I thought you'd definitely dodge that. Jim Dan hurried forward to wipe him down, his voice tight. Are you all right? Then the coach called fighter Zhou into the office and asked him, have you had something weighing on you lately? You look distracted, not like your usual self. Fighter Zhou only said, it's nothing, but he still couldn't help looking outside. Jim Dan was standing together with the other fighters. With a single glance, the coach could tell he simply couldn't focus. Then the coach asked him very solemnly, what is it that you really want right now? Do you truly want to become a legend in the fighting world? Or are you saying that even if you don't make it back to the champion's seat this time, you don't really care about retiring like this? I'm asking you this because I think that if you keep going like this, you're going to lose again. I believe that in terms of ability, you can beat Baek Junmyeong. But if you keep spacing out like this and can't concentrate, then forget about winning. Do you think that if you lose again this time, you'll still get to face him once more? Taking back the championship title that was snatched from you is really too hard. All the fighters are studying how to break your techniques. And of course Baek Junmyeong is doing the same. Snap out of it. This is the championship title you've staked your whole life on and wanted more than anything. So if you still want to go on living as a champion, you have to give it everything you've got right now. Go back early and get some rest today. Player Zhou began to think seriously. Is it that I want to win, or is it? He recalled what the director had said to him before, although what was said back then was indeed not wrong. At this moment, memories from his childhood suddenly surged up. Little by little, player Zhou made up his mind. Even if Jim Dan said those things to me, I absolutely cannot lose my composure. I have to prove that I am still formidable. Now is not the time to be led around by my emotions.